Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I'd been babysitting for about 2 years when the Andersons called me that Friday in October. 17 years old, trying to save every dollar I could for college, and honestly, I jumped at any opportunity to make some cash. Their place was huge, one of those old colonial houses with dark wood everywhere, and rooms that seemed to go on forever. Mr. Anderson worked at some investment firm downtown, while Mrs. Anderson did real estate, and they needed someone to watch Oliver and Mia while they went to a charity gala. Oliver was 8, really into dinosaurs and Legos, while Mia had just turned 6 and carried this raggedy stuffed rabbit everywhere she went. They seemed like good kids when I'd met them briefly the week before, quiet but friendly enough. The parents left around 4 that afternoon, said they'd be back by midnight, left me $60 on the counter for pizza, and told me to help myself to anything in the fridge. I figured it would be an easy night, feed the kids, maybe watch a Disney movie, get them in bed by 8:30, then catch up on my calculus homework. Everything went perfectly normal for the first few hours, which makes what happened later even harder to process. We built a massive Lego castle in the living room, ordered pepperoni pizza from this place called Gino's down the street, and the kids were actually being really sweet with each other, taking turns picking what to watch on TV. Around 7, we were cleaning up the dishes together when Mia said something that made every muscle in my body go tense. She was drying a plate with this faded dish towel, humming some tune from a cartoon, when she mentioned really casually that the man in the attic doesn't like pepperoni either. Oliver dropped the cup he was holding. It was plastic, thankfully, and his face went white as paper. He grabbed his sister's arm, not hard but firm, and told her to stop making stuff up. But the way he said it, the panic in his voice, told me he wasn't correcting her for lying. He was scared she'd said something she shouldn't have, and when I asked what she meant, both kids exchanged this look that made all the hair on my arms stand straight up. I tried to keep my voice light and asked them who they were talking about, maybe thinking it was some game they played or a story someone told them at school. Oliver immediately said nobody, and started putting dishes away really fast, but Mia, being 6 and not understanding whatever secret her brother was keeping, kept going. She said the man had been there for a while, that sometimes she could hear him walking around up there at night, and that Oliver had seen him too, but told her never to tell Mom and Dad, because they wouldn't believe them anyway. The attic access was in the hallway just outside the kids' bedrooms, one of those pull-down doors with a string hanging from it, and I'd noticed it earlier but hadn't thought much about it. Oliver was practically dragging Mia out of the kitchen at this point, saying she was making things up for attention, but the kid looked genuinely terrified, like he might actually start crying. That's when I heard it, this really distinct creaking sound from directly above us, like someone taking a careful step on old floorboards. We all went silent for probably 10 seconds, just standing there in the kitchen listening to the house. Old houses make noise, I kept telling myself. Wood settles, pipes expand and contract. There's always some logical explanation for these sounds. But then it happened again. Another creak, then another, in a clear pattern like someone was walking slowly across the floor above us. Oliver grabbed his sister's hand and whispered that they should go watch TV in the living room, but I could see he was shaking. Mia seemed less scared and more confused, like she couldn't understand why we were all acting weird about something she'd apparently been aware of for who knows how long. Told the kids to go to the living room and pick out a movie, trying to sound normal, even though my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Once they were gone, I stood there in that kitchen, looking up at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. The Andersons had probably just stored some boxes up there that were settling, or maybe they had mice. Lots of old houses have mice in the walls and attics. I went to check on the kids in the living room and found them huddled together on the couch, Oliver with his arm around Mia protectively, while she clutched her stuffed rabbit. They'd put on some cartoon, but neither was really watching it. Both of them kept looking toward the hallway that led to their bedrooms and the attic access. I sat down with them and tried to act normal, but after about 15 minutes I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed to know what was going on. I asked Oliver as gently as I could to tell me the truth about what Mia had said. At first he refused, kept insisting she was making it up. But when I promised I wouldn't think he was lying or crazy, he finally broke down. He said it started about 3 weeks ago when he woke up one night to use the bathroom and saw the attic door was open just a crack. He knew his parents never went up there. His mom had bad knees and his dad always said there was nothing up there but insulation and old junk from the previous owners. But that night, Oliver swore he saw fingers wrapped around the edge of the door, holding it open just slightly. And then the door had slowly, silently pulled shut. After that night, Oliver said he started noticing things. Food would go missing from the pantry, not a lot, but enough that he noticed because his mom had blamed him for eating a whole box of crackers he hadn't touched. Sometimes he'd hear footsteps above his room late at night, really soft ones like someone trying not to be heard. The worst part was about a week ago when he'd gotten up to get water and saw a shadow at the end of the hallway, just standing there by the attic access. He'd run back to his room and locked the door, and the next morning tried to tell his dad. But Mr. Anderson had said he was having nightmares from watching scary YouTube videos and took away his tablet for a week. Mia had apparently heard the footsteps too, but being younger, just accepted it as something normal. Oliver had told her it was probably just house sounds to keep her from getting scared, but she'd started calling it the man in the attic anyway. As Oliver was telling me all this, I kept listening for more sounds from above, and that's when I noticed something that made my whole body go cold. There was a thin line of dust on the hallway floor, right beneath the attic door, like someone had recently disturbed years of accumulated dirt, and it had filtered down through the cracks. I pulled out my phone and almost called the Andersons right then, but I stopped myself. What was I going to say? That their kids had told me a story about someone in the attic and I'd heard some creaking? They'd think I was either trying to scare them or that I was too immature to handle babysitting. Instead, I called my older brother Nathan, who was home from college for the weekend. He answered on the third ring and I could hear his video game in the background. I told him everything as quietly as I could while the kids watched their movie, and at first he laughed, said I was letting my imagination run wild. But when I mentioned the dust and the missing food, he got quiet and told me to grab the kids and leave the house immediately. He said he'd meet me outside in 15 minutes. He only lived about 10 minutes away, and we could figure out what to do from there. I was about to do exactly that when we heard something that changed everything. The clear, unmistakable sound of a toilet flushing from the second-floor bathroom, right next to the kids' bedrooms. The thing is, we were all in the living room on the first floor, and I knew for a fact that the Andersons didn't have any pets that could somehow trigger a flush. Oliver's face went completely white, and Mia actually started crying, burying her face in her rabbit. I grabbed both kids and my car keys, not even bothering with their jackets or my backpack, and we rushed toward the front door. But as we passed the staircase, I made the mistake of looking up toward the second floor. Standing at the top of the stairs was a man, probably in his 40s, wearing what looked like old sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, with greasy shoulder-length hair and this scraggly beard. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching us with these hollow, sunken eyes. The smell hit me then, too. Even from downstairs I could smell it, like unwashed clothes and spoiled food and something else I couldn't identify. For what felt like forever but was probably only 2 seconds, we just stared at each other. And then he took one step down the stairs, his bare foot making this wet slapping sound on the wood. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I yanked the front door open so hard it slammed against the wall, and we ran out into the dark October evening. Oliver was practically carrying Mia, who was sobbing uncontrollably, and I was fumbling with my car keys, dropping them twice on the driveway before managing to unlock my beat-up Toyota Corolla. We piled into the car and I locked all the doors immediately, starting the engine with trembling fingers. Through the house's front window, I could see the man standing in the living room now, just watching us through the glass. He wasn't chasing us or trying to hide. He just stood there like he was curious about what we'd do next. I threw the car in reverse and backed out of that driveway so fast I nearly hit the mailbox, and as we drove away, I saw him move toward the door like maybe he was going to come outside. I drove straight to the grocery store parking lot about a mile away, where there were lots of lights and people, and that's where Nathan found us 10 minutes later, all three of us still sitting in my car with the doors locked. Nathan called 911 while I called the Andersons, and Mrs. Anderson answered on the second ring, music and laughter loud in the background. When I told her what happened, trying to keep my voice steady so I wouldn't completely panic the kids who were listening, she went silent for so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then she started asking rapid-fire questions. What did he look like? Did he hurt anyone? Where were we now? And I could hear her telling her husband to get the car immediately. The police arrived at the house before the Andersons did, and Nathan followed them back there, while I stayed with the kids in the store parking lot, buying them hot chocolate from the Starbucks inside and trying to keep them calm. About an hour later, Officer Daniels called me to take a statement. They'd found the guy still in the house. Apparently he'd gone back up to the attic when he heard the sirens. He was a homeless man named William Torrey, who'd been reported missing from a halfway house about 40 miles away 3 months earlier. He'd been living in the Andersons' attic for at least a month, maybe longer, surviving on food he'd sneak down to steal at night, and using their bathroom when he thought everyone was asleep. The police found his makeshift living space up there. A sleeping bag he'd probably grabbed from the Andersons' garage, empty food containers stacked in a corner, bottles filled with urine because he couldn't always risk coming down to use the bathroom, and notebooks where he'd been writing down the family's schedule and routines. He knew when they left for work, when the kids got home from school, when they usually went to bed. He'd been entering through a broken ventilation grate on the side of the house that led directly into the attic, something the Andersons hadn't even known was damaged because it was hidden behind an overgrown bush. The detective told me later that Torrey had probably been watching us all evening through small gaps in the ceiling. There were several spots where he'd carefully made tiny holes to see into the rooms below. What really disturbed me was that he'd written about me in his notebook, noting that I was a new girl and that I'd arrived at 4 p.m. He'd been right above us the whole time, listening to everything, and only came down because he'd gotten too comfortable, too confident that we were just kids who wouldn't do anything even if we saw him. The Andersons were obviously horrified and kept apologizing to me and my parents, offering to pay for therapy if I needed it, asking over and over if I was okay. They moved out of that house within a month, and as far as I know, never went back even to pack everything. They hired a moving company to do it all. Oliver and Mia ended up needing counseling, especially Oliver, who blamed himself for not making his parents believe him sooner. Torrey was charged with breaking and entering, trespassing, and some other stuff I can't remember. But because he had mental health issues and hadn't technically hurt anyone, he only got 2 years in jail plus mandatory psychiatric treatment. I still babysit sometimes, but I always check every closet, every room, and yes, every attic access before the parents leave. I know the odds of something like this happening again are basically zero, but I can't help it. The thing that still keeps me up sometimes is thinking about all those nights the Anderson kids were sleeping just a few feet below a complete stranger who was watching them, studying them, and they were completely helpless. Oliver was right to be scared, and the fact that no one believed him until it was almost too late is something I don't think any of us involved will ever really get over. The August heat in 2018 was unbearable, the kind that makes the air shimmer above the pavement and turns your car into an oven, even with the AC blasting. I was 34 then, managing a small accounting firm downtown while my wife Rebecca taught 5th grade at the local elementary school. We lived in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes from the city center, one of those places where kids still rode bikes until dark and neighbors actually knew each other's names. Our twin daughters, Lily and Grace, had just turned 7 that summer, and finding reliable childcare had become our biggest challenge. Both sets of grandparents lived states away, and most teenagers in the area had summer jobs or were away at camps. That's when Rebecca found Melissa through a colleague at school, a 19-year-old college student home for summer break, studying early childhood education, with glowing references from 3 families in the neighboring town. Melissa had been watching the girls for about 6 weeks by then, and honestly, she seemed like a gift from heaven. She'd show up 15 minutes early, always had activities planned, and the girls absolutely adored her. She had this warm, easy way about her. Auburn hair, always in a neat ponytail, modest clothes, never on her phone when we got home. The girls would beg us to go out just so Melissa could come over. That particular Saturday, Rebecca and I had tickets to her company's annual fundraising gala at the Riverside Hotel downtown. It was one of those events you couldn't really skip. Her principal would be there, along with most of the school board. Rebecca had bought a new dress specifically for it, this deep green number that made her eyes pop, and I'd actually gotten my good suit dry cleaned for once. We'd left the house around 6:30, giving Melissa the usual rundown. Bedtime at 8:30, emergency numbers on the fridge, leftover pasta in the microwave if she got hungry. The gala turned out to be one of those painfully formal affairs where everyone stands around making small talk, while pretending the tiny portions of overpriced food are actually filling. By 8:15, Rebecca was struggling in her heels, and I'd already heard the same story about the school district's budget 3 times from different board members. We were stationed near the silent auction table when Rebecca's principal, Mr. Hutchinson, started what promised to be a lengthy monologue about standardized testing reforms. About 20 minutes into his speech, his wife suddenly clutched her stomach and went pale. Turned out the shrimp appetizers hadn't agreed with her. In the chaos that followed, with Mr. Hutchinson frantically calling for his car and apologizing profusely, Rebecca and I exchanged a look. Nobody would notice if we slipped out early too. We made our quiet goodbyes to a few colleagues, claiming I had an early morning conference call, and headed for the parking garage. The relief of escaping that stuffy ballroom was immediate. Rebecca kicked off her heels before we even reached the car, laughing about how we'd just gotten a free pass from the world's most boring event. The drive home was peaceful, windows down to let in the cooler evening air, Rebecca humming along to some old song on the radio. We'd decided not to text Melissa we were coming back early, partly because we didn't want her to feel like we didn't trust her to handle the full evening, but mostly because Rebecca thought it would be nice to surprise the girls if they were still awake. Maybe we'd all have ice cream and watch a movie together. As we turned onto our street, I noticed how quiet everything seemed. Porch lights on, a few TVs flickering through windows, the Davenport's cat prowling across their lawn. Our house looked exactly as we'd left it, warm light spilling from the living room window, Rebecca's garden gnomes standing guard by the walkway. I pulled into the driveway behind Melissa's beat-up Ford Focus, and we gathered our things, Rebecca still carrying her heels, both of us moving quietly in case the girls were already asleep. The front door was locked, which was good. We'd stressed to Melissa about keeping it secured after dark. I turned my key slowly, trying not to make too much noise. The moment we stepped inside, I heard voices from the living room. Melissa's familiar laugh mixed with something else, a deeper voice that made me pause in the entryway. Rebecca heard it too, her hand finding my arm, both of us standing there in the dim hallway trying to process what we were hearing. It was definitely a man's voice, low and rough, saying something I couldn't quite make out. Then Melissa laughed again, but it sounded different this time, nervous, higher-pitched than usual. Rebecca and I exchanged a quick glance, and I moved forward first, my socks silent on the hardwood floor. The living room doorway was about 10 feet ahead, and as I got closer I could smell something strange, cigarette smoke, which we absolutely never allowed in the house, mixed with something else, like motor oil or gasoline. The TV was on but muted, casting shifting blue light across the hallway wall. I heard the man's voice again, clearer now. "They always keep the good stuff hidden somewhere. Check that cabinet over there." My whole body went rigid. Rebecca was right behind me, her breathing quick and shallow, and I could feel her trembling slightly. Every instinct told me to rush in, but something about that voice, the casual way he talked about going through our things, made me pause. I peered around the doorframe just enough to see inside. Melissa was on our couch, and next to her sat a man I'd never seen before. He was probably mid-40s, wearing a stained gray work shirt and jeans with holes at the knees. His hair was thin and greasy, pulled back in a stringy ponytail, and even from across the room I could see the crude tattoos covering his arms. Not professional work, more like the kind people get in prison. His boots were on our coffee table, leaving dirt marks on the glass, and in his hand was a beer from our fridge. But what made my chest tighten was the way he was sitting, completely relaxed, like he owned the place, one arm draped behind Melissa on the couch. She looked small next to him, her usual ponytail messy, and she kept glancing toward the stairs that led up to the girls' rooms. "Come on, baby, don't be so uptight," the man said, pulling Melissa closer. "I told you they won't be back for hours. Rich people love their fancy parties." His hand moved to her shoulder and I saw her stiffen. "Besides, you said their kids are heavy sleepers. We could make all the noise we want." That's when I noticed the backpack by his feet. Black, military style, partially unzipped. Something metallic gleamed inside, but I couldn't tell what it was from my angle. Melissa mumbled something I couldn't hear, and he laughed, an ugly sound that made my skin prickle. "Don't worry about it. After tonight, you won't have to babysit anymore. We'll have enough to get out of this dump of a town." He took another swig of beer, then stood up suddenly, and I pulled back into the shadows. "Where'd you say they keep the jewelry again? Upstairs bedroom, right?" I heard footsteps moving toward the hallway, toward us, and Rebecca grabbed my arm so tight her nails dug through my sleeve. I pulled Rebecca back quickly, guiding her into the kitchen as silently as possible. My mind was racing, trying to process what we just heard. This man was planning to rob us, and Melissa was involved somehow. But the way she'd looked, the tension in her body, made me wonder if she was there willingly. Rebecca was already pulling out her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed 911. I kept myself positioned where I could see the hallway, ready to act if he headed upstairs toward our daughters. The dispatcher answered, and Rebecca whispered our address, explaining the situation in short, clipped sentences. I heard movement from the living room, heavy footsteps pacing, Melissa's voice saying something about waiting, about being careful. Then the man's voice, sharper now. "I've been waiting in that stinking garage for 3 hours. You said this would be easy money. Now stop being scared and help me find their stuff." The garage. He'd been in our garage, waiting. The thought made me sick. How long had this been planned? The dispatcher was telling Rebecca to stay on the line, that units were on their way, but to stay hidden and not confront the intruders. The next few minutes felt like hours. We could hear them moving around the living room, drawers being opened, things being moved. At one point I heard something glass break, followed by Melissa's sharp intake of breath and the man saying, "Shut up, it's just some cheap vase." Then suddenly, horrifyingly, I heard small footsteps on the stairs. "Melissa." It was Lily's voice, sleepy and confused. "I heard something break. Is everything okay?" My heart nearly stopped. Rebecca's face went white and I had to physically hold her back from running out there. We heard Melissa's voice, artificially bright. "Everything's fine, sweetie. Just drop something, go back to bed." But Lily, always the more persistent twin, came down another step. "Who's that man? Is that your dad?" There was a pause that seemed to stretch forever. Then the man's voice, trying to sound friendly but failing. "Yeah, kid, I'm her dad. Just came to pick her up. Go back to sleep." Another pause, then Lily. "But Melissa said her dad lives in Colorado." "You don't sound like you're from Colorado." Everything happened fast after that. The man cursed loudly and I heard rapid footsteps. He was heading toward the stairs, toward Lily. That's when every careful thought left my head. I burst out of the kitchen shouting, "Get away from her!" He spun around, his face a mix of surprise and rage. Up close, I could see the wild look in his bloodshot eyes. the way his jaw clenched and unclenched. Melissa jumped up from the couch, crying, "No, no, no, this wasn't supposed to happen like this." Lily stood frozen on the stairs, her pink pajamas with the unicorn print looking so small and vulnerable. The man reached into his backpack, and that's when I saw it clearly. A large hunting knife in a leather sheath. But before he could grab it, we heard sirens, multiple sirens getting louder fast. His eyes darted between me, the stairs, and the front door. "You called the cops?" he snarled at Melissa. "You stupid little—" But she was already backing away from him, shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. The sirens were right outside now, and I saw red and blue lights flashing through the windows. "Lily, go to your room and lock the door, now!" I commanded, and thankfully she ran back upstairs. The man looked like a trapped animal, his hand still hovering near the backpack. The police announcement came through a megaphone. "This is the police, come out with your hands visible." The man grabbed his backpack and made a dash for the back door, but Rebecca had locked it from the kitchen, and he struggled with the deadbolt, cursing frantically. That's when the front door burst open, and 3 officers rushed in, weapons drawn. "Drop the bag! Hands where we can see them!" The man actually tried to rush past them, which was the stupidest thing he could have done. They had him on the ground in seconds, his face pressed against our hardwood floor while they cuffed him. Melissa had collapsed on the couch, sobbing hysterically, repeating, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," over and over. One officer stayed with her while another secured the scene. Rebecca ran upstairs to check on both girls, and I heard Grace's door open, both twins crying but safe. The officer examining the man's backpack pulled out not just the hunting knife, but also zip ties, a roll of duct tape, and what looked like a small crowbar. "Jesus," he muttered, then louder to his partner. "Call for another unit. This is bigger than a simple break-in." What we learned over the next several hours turned our relief into a different kind of horror. The man's name was Robert Crenshaw, and he had a record that made my blood run cold. Aggravated assault, attempted kidnapping of a minor in 2016, and he'd just been released from prison 8 months ago. Melissa, sobbing in the police station, told them everything. She'd met him at a gas station 3 weeks earlier. He seemed charming at first, buying her coffee, telling her how pretty she was, how mature she seemed for her age. He'd slowly convinced her that we were wealthy people who wouldn't even notice if some jewelry went missing, that it would be victimless, easy money for them to start a new life together. But the detective who interviewed us later told us something that still haunts me. They'd found a notebook in his car with detailed notes about our routine, the girls' schedules, even drawings of our house layout. Next to Lily and Grace's names, he'd written, "Blonde, approximately 50-60 pounds. Quiet neighborhood. Garage has broken lock on side door." The robbery story was just what he'd told Melissa to get her cooperation. The zip ties and duct tape suggested something much darker. The detective believed he'd been planning to take the girls, and Melissa had unknowingly given him the perfect opportunity. She hadn't known about his record. He'd told her his name was Alex and that he worked construction. She thought she was helping with a simple theft, not realizing she'd let a predator into our home. The guilt destroyed her. Last I heard, she'd dropped out of college and moved back with her parents out of state. As for us, we moved within 6 months. Even after installing security cameras and new locks, we could never feel safe in that house again. The girls went through months of therapy, and Grace still has nightmares sometimes. But we were lucky. We came home early that night. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if Mr. Hutchinson's wife hadn't gotten sick from those shrimp, and I have to stop myself from going down that dark path. The semester had just started at Penn State, and I was desperately searching for ways to make extra cash. My roommate Jessica and I were splitting a cramped apartment near campus, and between textbooks and groceries, my savings account was looking pathetic. I was 20 years old, majoring in psychology, and had been babysitting since high school. It seemed like the perfect side gig while keeping up with classes. Every morning, I'd grab my laptop and head to this small cafe called the Grindhouse, about 2 blocks from campus. They had decent Wi-Fi, and the owner, Mrs. Chen, always gave students free refills. That Tuesday morning in early September was no different, except for the man who approached me while I was updating my profile on a babysitting website. He looked completely normal, maybe mid-30s, wearing a button-down shirt and khakis like he'd just stepped out of an office. Clean-shaven wedding ring, carrying a leather messenger bag. Everything about him screamed suburban dad. He apologized for interrupting, said he'd overheard me talking on the phone about needing babysitting work, and explained that he and his wife were desperate for someone reliable. His name was David Brennan, and he had twin girls, 6 years old, named Sophie and Ella. He showed me photos on his phone. 2 adorable blonde kids in matching sundresses, playing on a swing set in what looked like a beautiful backyard. He said his regular nanny had just quit without notice, and his wife was traveling for work. The job would be 3 evenings a week, paying $25 an hour, cash. That was almost double what I usually made, and he needed someone to start that very evening. I should have noticed the weird details right then. He kept checking his phone every few seconds, like he was waiting for something. When I asked for his wife's contact information, he said she was on a flight to Seattle and wouldn't be reachable until tomorrow. He gave me the address, 4782 Willow Creek Drive, and said to arrive at 7 sharp because he had a business dinner downtown. I asked if I could meet the girls first, maybe stop by in the afternoon, but he insisted they were at school until 5 and then had piano lessons. Everything had an explanation. Every question had an answer that made just enough sense. He even gave me a list of the girls' allergies. Sophie couldn't have peanuts, Ella was lactose intolerant, and their bedtime routine written on a post-it note. He paid me $40 up front as a good faith deposit and shook my hand with this firm, professional grip before leaving. The rest of the day, I couldn't focus on my classes. I kept thinking about that easy money, how I could finally afford to fix my car's broken AC before the weather got hot again. I texted Jessica about the job, and she said I was lucky to find something that paid so well. Around 6:30, I drove out to Willow Creek Drive, following my GPS through neighborhoods that got progressively nicer the further I went from campus. The houses were huge, with manicured lawns and those fancy lampposts at the end of each driveway. When I pulled up to 4782, my first thought was that these people definitely could afford $25 an hour. It was a beautiful 2-story colonial with white pillars and black shutters, the kind of place you see in real estate magazines. But something was weird. There were no toys in the yard, no bikes in the driveway, no colorful curtains in what should have been kids' bedroom windows. I rang the doorbell at exactly 7 o'clock, and David answered immediately, like he'd been standing right behind the door waiting. He was dressed differently now, jeans and a polo shirt instead of business clothes, and there was this energy about him that hadn't been there at the cafe. He kept talking fast, explaining that the girls were already upstairs playing quietly, that they'd eaten dinner, that they were shy with new people, so I shouldn't worry if they didn't come down right away. The house smelled strange, like fresh paint mixed with some kind of chemical cleaner, even though everything looked lived in. He showed me around quickly, too quickly, pointing out the kitchen, the bathroom, the living room with its leather furniture and massive TV. There were photos on the mantel, but when I looked closer, they were all generic stock photos that come with picture frames. Not a single real family photo anywhere. The refrigerator had no drawings, no magnets, nothing that said kids lived here. David said he was already running late and practically pushed the emergency contact list into my hands. His cell number, the restaurant where he'd be, and supposedly his wife's number, though he reminded me she was unreachable. He grabbed a jacket from the coat rack and headed for the door, telling me the girls would probably come down for a snack around 8. Bedtime was 9:30, and I should make myself comfortable. Then he was gone, and I heard his car pull away fast, tires actually squealing a little on the pavement. I stood in that too quiet house listening for any sound of children playing upstairs. Nothing. No footsteps, no giggles, no TV sounds, no toys clattering. I called out, "Sophie, Ella, I'm Amanda, your babysitter for tonight." My voice echoed in the stairwell. I walked to the bottom of the stairs and listened harder. The house was completely, unnaturally silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The hallway was dark with 4 closed doors. I knocked on the first one, said "Girls," and opened it. Empty. A guest bedroom with a perfectly made bed and nothing else. The second door was a bathroom. The third was an office with a desk and computer. The fourth door was supposedly the girls' room. It had 2 small beds with pink comforters, a few stuffed animals arranged too perfectly, and a bookshelf with children's books that looked brand new, spines uncracked. The closet had exactly 6 outfits hanging in 2 sizes, tags still on some of them. That's when my whole body went cold. This wasn't a kid's room. This was a stage set. I pulled out my phone to text Jessica, but I had no signal, not one bar. I tried connecting to Wi-Fi, but there was none. I went back downstairs, my legs feeling weak, and tried the landline in the kitchen. Dead. No dial tone, just silence. The front door was my first instinct, but when I turned the knob, it wouldn't budge. Not locked in a normal way. It didn't even rattle or move slightly. I ran to the back door in the kitchen. Same thing. The windows all had locks on them that needed a key from the inside. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I was trapped. That's when I heard a door open somewhere in the house. Not upstairs, but somewhere on the first floor. Maybe a basement door or a closet I hadn't noticed. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, were coming from the back of the house. Not David's quick, nervous energy from before. These were patient, measured steps. Then I heard another set of footsteps from upstairs, directly above me. There were at least 2 people in this house with me, and neither of them were 6-year-old girls. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen block, my hand trembling so bad I could barely grip it. The footsteps stopped, both sets at the exact same moment, like they were communicating somehow. The silence was worse than the footsteps. I backed into a corner where I could see both the hallway and the kitchen entrance, holding that knife in front of me, like it could actually protect me from whatever this was. Then I saw him, not David, but another man, older, maybe 50, with gray hair and wearing work clothes like a maintenance uniform. He stood at the kitchen entrance, not moving, just watching me with this blank expression. He didn't look angry or excited or anything, just empty, like this was a normal Tuesday night for him. "She's in here," he called out, not to me but to whoever was upstairs. His voice was calm, conversational. The footsteps upstairs started again, heading toward the staircase. I screamed at him to stay back, waving the knife, but he just tilted his head slightly, studying me like I was an interesting specimen. That's when I remembered the window in the bathroom. It was smaller than the others, the kind with frosted glass that usually just has a simple latch. I had maybe 10 seconds before whoever was upstairs made it down. I threw the knife at the gray-haired man. It missed completely but made him step back, and I ran. I sprinted to the bathroom, slammed the door, and locked it. The window was small but not impossible. I could hear them both outside the door now, not pounding or yelling, just calmly trying the handle. One of them said something about the new lock working perfectly. I stood on the toilet, punched the frosted glass with my elbow wrapped in a towel. It shattered outward, the sound incredibly loud in that quiet house. I could hear them fumbling with keys now, multiple keys, like they had a whole ring of them. I squeezed through that window, feeling the remaining glass scrape my stomach and legs, not caring about the cuts. I dropped 8 feet onto the grass, landing hard on my ankle but immediately getting up and running. Behind me, I could hear the bathroom door finally burst open, and one of them shouting something I couldn't make out. I ran through the backyard, which was deeper and darker than it looked from the front. There was a wooden fence at the back, old and tall, but I could see a neighbor's house lit up beyond it. I threw myself at that fence, climbing like my life depended on it, because it did. I could hear one of them coming through the window behind me, grunting as he tried to fit through the opening I'd barely managed. My hands were slippery with blood from the glass cuts, making it hard to grip the fence boards. When I finally got to the top and swung my leg over, I saw the gray-haired man coming around the side of the house, moving faster than I expected. He was carrying something, rope or zip ties, I couldn't tell in the dark. I dropped into the neighbor's yard and ran straight to their back door, pounding on it and screaming for help. An elderly woman answered, took one look at me, bloody, crying, hysterical, and immediately pulled me inside, locking the door behind us. Her husband called 911 while she grabbed towels for my cuts. I was sobbing so hard I could barely tell the operator what happened. The police arrived within minutes, but when they went to the house at 4782 Willow Creek Drive, it was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. The furniture was gone, the fake kids' room was cleared out, even the stock photos had been removed. The neighbors said the house had been a rental property, vacant for months, and someone must have broken in to use it. They found the listing online. It had been taken down that very evening. David Brennan, of course, wasn't a real name. The police found 3 other reports in different states, same setup, fake babysitting job, but I was the only one who had gotten away. They never caught them. I was 19 and needed money for college, so when my mom's co-worker mentioned her neighbors needed a babysitter for their 8-month-old daughter, I jumped at the chance. The Thompsons lived in this beautiful colonial house about 20 minutes from campus, the kind with the wraparound porch and those expensive shutters that actually worked. Mrs. Thompson was a pediatric nurse who worked nights, and Mr. Thompson traveled for some investment firm. They paid $60 for 4 hours, which was incredible money for basically watching Netflix while a baby slept. That particular Thursday in early May, Mrs. Thompson had left for her shift at 7, and Mr. Thompson was supposedly in Boston for some conference. The baby, Chloe, had gone down easy around 8:30, and I was settled on their leather couch with my laptop, working on a paper about Victorian literature that was due Monday. The doorbell rang at exactly 9:47. I remember because I'd just checked my phone to see if my boyfriend had texted back. Nobody ever came to the Thompsons' house that late, especially not on a weeknight. Through the peephole, I saw a man in a wrinkled gray suit, maybe 45, with this weird nervous energy that made him shift his weight from foot to foot. His hair stuck up in places like he'd been running his fingers through it repeatedly, and there was something about his eyes. They were too wide, too focused, like he was running on pure adrenaline. When I opened the door with the chain still on, he immediately started talking, his words tumbling out fast and desperate. "I need to speak with Michael Thompson. Tell him Doug Lawson is here. Tell him I know what he did with the pension fund, with my mother's retirement, with everyone's money." His breath smelled like coffee and something metallic, and I noticed his hands kept moving to his jacket pocket, then away, then back again. I tried to explain that Mr. Thompson wasn't home, that I was just the babysitter, but Doug wasn't listening. He pushed against the door hard enough that the chain started pulling the frame, and his voice got louder, more aggressive. "Don't lie to me. His car is in the garage. I checked. That black Audi with the custom plates." The thing was, he was right. Mr. Thompson's car was there because he'd taken an Uber to the airport. Something about drinking with clients before his flight. I was about to suggest he call Mr. Thompson's office tomorrow, when Doug pulled his hand out of his pocket, and everything in my body went cold. The gun wasn't huge like in movies. It was small, black, almost looked like a toy except for how heavy it seemed in his shaking hand. "Open the door," he said, and his voice had gone quiet, which was somehow worse than the yelling. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just need to wait for Michael. We need to have a conversation about the 43 families he destroyed." Before I could react, before I could even think about slamming the door, he pushed harder and the chain snapped, just tore right out of the wood like it was nothing. He stumbled into the foyer and I backed up until I hit the console table, knocking over a vase that shattered on the hardwood floor. The sound was explosive in the quiet house, and immediately Chloe started crying upstairs. Doug's head snapped toward the stairs and his whole face changed. This strange mix of surprise and something else, maybe panic. "There's a kid here?" he asked, like he hadn't considered that possibility. I nodded, unable to form words, and watched as he closed the front door behind him, turning the deadbolt with this deliberate slowness that made my chest tight. "Get the baby," he said, waving the gun toward the stairs but not exactly pointing it at me. "Bring it down here. Michael needs to see what he's fighting for when he gets home. He needs to understand what it feels like when someone takes everything from you." My legs felt like water as I climbed the stairs, each step taking forever while Chloe's cries got louder. She was standing in her crib, face red and streaked with tears, clutching the rails with those tiny, perfect fingers. When I picked her up, she grabbed onto my shirt and buried her face in my shoulder, still sobbing but starting to calm down. I could hear Doug pacing downstairs, his shoes clicking on the hardwood in this irregular rhythm. 3 steps, pause, 5 steps, pause, 2 steps. I held Chloe tighter and walked back down, each stair creaking under my weight. Doug was in the living room now, standing by the window with the curtain pulled back slightly, watching the street. The gun was still in his hand but hanging at his side, and I could see his finger wasn't on the trigger, which felt important somehow. "Sit," he said without looking at me, gesturing toward the couch with his free hand. "We're going to wait." I sat down with Chloe on my lap, and she immediately started reaching for my phone on the coffee table, making these little chirping sounds she always made when she wanted something. Doug turned from the window and really looked at her for the first time, and his expression did something complicated. His jaw clenched and unclenched, and he rubbed his face with his free hand. "How old?" he asked, his voice different now, rougher. When I told him 8 months, he made this sound that wasn't quite a laugh. My grandson would have been about that age. Would have been if his parents hadn't lost their house. If my son hadn't. He trailed off and went back to watching the window. "Michael Thompson told them it was a sure thing. Told all of us. Trust me," he said. "This is how you secure your family's future." And then he walked away with his commission while we lost everything. My son drove his car into a bridge abutment 3 months later, 60 miles an hour. They said it was an accident. The way he said accident made it clear he didn't believe that. And suddenly I understood this wasn't just about money. Chloe started fussing again, squirming in my arms and making those pre-cry whimpers that meant she was hungry. I asked Doug if I could get her bottle from the kitchen, and he followed me, staying about 6 feet behind like he was trying to maintain some kind of boundary. The formula was already made in the fridge. Mrs. Thompson always prepared everything in advance, and I heated it in the bottle warmer while Doug leaned against the door frame, the gun now tucked in his waistband but still visible. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly, and when I told him it was Jenny, he nodded slowly. "Jenny. You seem like a good kid. I'm sorry you're in the middle of this, but Michael needs to understand consequences. He's been avoiding me for months, blocked my number, had security escort me out of his office building. His lawyer sent a cease and desist letter. Can you believe that? A cease and desist like I'm the criminal." His laugh was bitter and sharp, and it made Chloe turn her head toward him, bottle still in her mouth, studying him with those serious baby eyes. We went back to the living room, and Doug started talking more like he needed someone to understand. He told me about the investment scheme, about how Michael had specifically targeted older clients at his previous firm, people close to retirement who couldn't afford to take risks. He showed them fake portfolios, doctored returns, had this whole elaborate setup with false documents and even a fake auditor who was actually his college roommate. 43 families lost their retirement savings. Most of them were too embarrassed to even report it, thought it was their fault for being greedy. But I did my research. I tracked down every single person he scammed. The FBI said there wasn't enough evidence that the paper trail was too clean. But I know what he did. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of a younger man who looked just like him, standing next to a woman holding a newborn. That was my son Andrew. Software engineer. Had his whole life planned out. His voice cracked on the word planned, and for a second the gun in his waistband looked less like a weapon and more like the last option of a desperate man. Around 10:30, Chloe fell asleep in my arms, her weight warm and trusting against my chest. Doug had moved to the armchair across from us, and I could see him fighting exhaustion. His eyelids would droop, then snap open whenever a car passed outside. I carefully reached for my phone, thinking maybe I could text someone, but he noticed immediately. "Put it in the kitchen," he said, not angry, just tired. "Please. I can't have you calling anyone until Michael gets here. He usually comes home by 11 when he travels. Never stays overnight if he can help it." As I walked to the kitchen with Chloe still sleeping against me, I noticed the family photos on the wall. Michael Thompson smiling at a company party, his arm around his wife, both of them looking successful and untouchable. When I came back, Doug was staring at those same photos with an expression I couldn't read. "You know what the worst part is?" he said quietly. "He probably doesn't even remember my son's name. Just another account number in his scam. Andrew Lawson, reduced to a statistic." At 11:15, we heard a car in the driveway. Doug jumped up so fast he knocked over a glass of water I'd set on the side table, and his hand went straight to the gun. Through the window, I could see Mr. Thompson getting out of an Uber, checking his phone as he walked toward the door. Doug positioned himself behind the door, telling me to stay on the couch with the baby, to not move, to not say anything. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure Chloe would wake up from the vibration. The key turned in the lock, and Mr. Thompson walked in already talking. "Jenny, sorry I'm late. Flight got delayed and—" He stopped mid-sentence when he saw my face, and then Doug stepped out from behind the door. "Hello, Michael," Doug said, and Mr. Thompson's briefcase hit the floor with a thud that seemed to echo forever. "We need to talk about Andrew Lawson. You remember that name, don't you? Or was he just victim number 37 to you?" Mr. Thompson's face went white. Not the shocked white of surprise, but the guilty white of recognition. And I knew then that everything Doug had said was true. "Doug, let's talk about this," Mr. Thompson said, his hands raised slightly, his voice taking on that smooth salesman tone that probably worked in boardrooms. "I understand you're upset. What happened with the fund was unfortunate, but it was a market downturn, not fraud. Your son's death was a tragedy, but—" Doug cut him off by pulling out the gun, not pointing it at anyone, just holding it. Don't you dare stand there and lie to my face. I have the emails, Michael. The ones you thought you deleted. Your roommate kept copies before you threw him under the bus, too. $60,000 my mother had saved over 40 years of teaching 3rd grade. Gone. You bought that Audi the next week." Mr. Thompson's eyes darted to me and Chloe, and something shifted in his face. "Your daughter," Doug continued, his voice breaking slightly. "You get to hold your daughter. You get to watch her grow up. My son will never, Andrew will never—" He couldn't finish the sentence, and the gun in his hand started shaking. What happened next took maybe 10 seconds but felt like an hour. "Mr. Thompson lunged forward, not at Doug but toward us, toward his daughter, and Doug swung the gun up instinctively. The sound Chloe made when she woke up, this piercing shriek of pure fear, seemed to break something in Doug. He looked at the gun in his hand like he'd never seen it before, then at the terrified baby in my arms, and his whole body just crumpled. The gun fell to the floor, and he dropped to his knees, sobbing these horrible broken sounds. "Mr. Thompson grabbed the gun and kicked it across the room, then pulled out his phone to call 911. But his hands were trembling so badly he could barely dial. "I just wanted him to understand," Doug kept saying between sobs. "I just wanted someone to acknowledge what he did to us." I sat there holding Chloe, who was now screaming at full volume, watching this middle-aged man fall apart on the expensive hardwood floor while Mr. Thompson spoke rapidly to the dispatcher, giving our address, saying "armed intruder" over and over like it was the only phrase he knew. The police arrived within minutes. 3 cars with lights blazing, officers rushing in with their hands on their weapons. Doug didn't resist at all. He just sat there on the floor with his hands visible, tears still streaming down his face. As they cuffed him and read him his rights, he looked at Mr. Thompson one last time. The evidence is in a safety deposit box at First National. Box 447. The FBI will want to see it." Mr. Thompson's face went even paler, if that was possible, and he started to say something, but one of the officers was already asking him questions about the break-in. They took Doug away, and I heard later that he was charged with breaking and entering, criminal threatening, and unlawful possession of a firearm. But the strangest part came 2 weeks later when I saw in the news that Michael Thompson had been arrested for investment fraud. Turns out Doug's evidence was solid. Emails, recorded phone calls, bank records, everything. The FBI had reopened the case. Mrs. Thompson called me the next day to make sure I was okay, and to tell me they wouldn't need me to babysit anymore. They were moving, she said, somewhere fresh. She sent me a check for $500 with a note that just said, "I'm sorry. I never told anyone the whole truth about that night, about how Mr. Thompson's face confirmed his guilt before Doug even showed the evidence, or how Doug had specifically avoided pointing the gun at anyone until that last moment of panic. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I see Chloe's picture on Mrs. Thompson's Instagram. She's 3 now, living in Michigan under what I assume is her mother's maiden name. Doug Lawson got 18 months in minimum security and mandatory counseling. Michael Thompson got 12 years federal time and was ordered to pay restitution, though I doubt those 43 families will ever see much of their money back. There's no clean ending to this story, no moment where everything made sense. Just a Thursday night where I got caught between 2 men destroyed by greed and grief, while a baby cried in my arms and everything unraveled in a stranger's living room. Saturday nights usually meant hanging out with friends at the mall or catching a movie, but that particular evening in early November found me driving through an unfamiliar neighborhood with my phone's GPS guiding me to Oakwood Court. I was 17, had been babysitting for extra cash since freshman year, and Mrs. Coleman was offering $50 for what she promised would be an easy night watching her 6-year-old son Noah. She'd found me through a mom's Facebook group where several parents had recommended me, and when she called 2 days earlier, her voice carried that particular strain of desperation that meant her regular sitter had bailed. The money would cover half my car insurance for the month, and honestly, spending a few hours watching cartoons with a kid seemed better than another night scrolling through social media while my friends posted stories from parties I couldn't afford to attend. Their house sat at the very end of the cul-de-sac, one of those modern 2-stories with big windows and gray siding that seem to be popping up everywhere lately. Behind it, thick woods stretched out into darkness, the trees already bare from autumn wind. Mr. Coleman greeted me at the door in a tuxedo that pulled tight across his shoulders, fumbling with cufflinks while his wife's voice drifted from upstairs, something about not finding the right shoes. Noah stood beside his father, clutching a stuffed triceratops and studying me with those serious eyes that some kids get when meeting new people. Mrs. Coleman rushed down the stairs 5 minutes later, in a burgundy dress, her hair still slightly damp from curling, and launched into rapid-fire instructions. Emergency numbers on the fridge, pediatrician's info in the drawer, Noah already ate dinner, bedtime at 9 sharp, absolutely no scary movies even if he begs. They were gone within 10 minutes, leaving behind the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the quiet hum of a house I didn't know. Noah turned out to be one of those easy kids who mostly entertained himself. We built a fortress out of couch cushions in the living room, and he showed me his collection of dinosaur books, explaining in detail which ones were herbivores and which ones would definitely eat us if they were still alive. Around 8:30, while we were halfway through his favorite animated movie about talking cars, I noticed movement outside the big picture window that faced the front yard. Just a quick shadow passing by, probably someone walking their dog. But when I looked closer, I could make out a figure standing at the edge of the driveway, right where the streetlights reach faded into darkness. They weren't moving, just standing there facing the house. I kept Noah distracted, not wanting to scare him, but every few minutes I'd glance back and the person would still be there. After about 15 minutes, I casually got up to get a snack and peeked through the kitchen window for a different angle. The figure had moved closer, now standing by the Coleman's mailbox, still watching. I told myself it was probably just someone from the neighborhood, maybe a teenager smoking where their parents couldn't see them, or someone waiting for a ride. But something about the way they stood so still, never checking a phone, never shifting their weight, made my chest feel tight. Noah asked for juice, and while I poured it in the kitchen, I noticed the side door that led to the garage. Mrs. Coleman had mentioned it during her rush tour, saying it was tricky, and to make sure it was locked, because sometimes it didn't catch properly. I checked it, definitely locked. Through the small window in the door, I could see into the dark garage, and beyond that, another window that showed the side yard. My breath caught. The figure was there now, standing between the house and the fence, maybe 10 feet from where I was standing. This close, I could see it was a man, tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark jacket with the hood up. He wasn't looking at the garage door, though. His head was tilted up toward the second-floor windows. Grabbed my phone and scrolled to Mrs. Coleman's number, then hesitated. What would I even say? There's someone standing in your yard? He hadn't done anything threatening, hadn't tried to get in, hadn't even approached the doors. They'd be at their gala by now, probably just sitting down to dinner. I decided to text my mom instead, keeping it casual, just letting her know where I was and that everything was fine. Noah wanted to show me his room before bed, so I carried him upstairs on my back, making dinosaur noises to keep things light. His bedroom was at the front of the house, decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and more dinosaur posters than I could count. While he brushed his teeth in the bathroom, I stood by his window and carefully pulled the curtain aside just enough to see out. The man was back at the front of the house now, standing in the middle of the lawn. From this angle, I could see he was wearing work boots and dark pants, maybe jeans. His face was completely hidden by the hood, but I could tell he was looking up, directly at the window where I stood. I stepped back quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. Noah came padding back in his socks, and I tucked him into bed, trying to keep my voice steady while I read him a story about a friendly brontosaurus. He was out within 10 minutes, his breathing deep and even, still clutching the stuffed triceratops. I left his door cracked open like Mrs. Coleman had instructed and went back downstairs, every nerve in my body on high alert. The living room felt too exposed with those big windows, so I settled in the kitchen, where I could see both the front door and the side door to the garage. I texted my friend Jenna, asking if she was still up, needing the connection to someone, anyone. While waiting for her response, I heard it, a soft scraping sound from the side of the house, like someone dragging something against the siding. I crept to the side door window and peered out. The man was right there, his face inches from the glass, though I still couldn't make out his features in the darkness. But what made my whole body go cold was what I saw in his hand, a small notebook where he was writing something down, his eyes never leaving mine through the glass. I stumbled backward, knocking into the kitchen counter, and when I looked again, he was gone. Just empty darkness where he'd been standing seconds before. My phone buzzed, Jenna responding with some gossip about a party, but I couldn't focus on the words. I did a quick check of every door and window on the first floor, making sure everything was locked, yanking on each handle twice to be certain. The house had an alarm system, but Mrs. Coleman hadn't given me the code, only mentioned that they rarely used it. I found a large kitchen knife in the drawer and set it on the counter, then felt ridiculous and put it back, then grabbed it again. The silence in the house was suffocating, every small sound. The refrigerator humming, the heater clicking on, made me jump. I positioned myself where I could see the front door, the stairs, and the hallway leading to the garage door all at once. 20 minutes passed with no sign of the man. Maybe he'd left. Maybe he was just some local weirdo who liked to freak people out. I started to relax slightly, even managed to respond to Jenna's texts with shaky thumbs. Then I heard Noah crying upstairs, that confused, half-awake whimper kids do when they have bad dreams. I rushed up, taking the stairs two at a time, and found him sitting up in bed, rubbing his eyes. He said someone was tapping on his window, that it woke him up. My blood turned to ice water in my veins, but I kept my voice calm, telling him it was probably just a tree branch. His window faced the front yard. There were no trees close enough to reach it. I picked him up and carried him downstairs with me, making up a story about having a special movie night since his parents were gone. I settled him on the couch with a blanket and put on another cartoon, volume low. While he watched, mesmerized and still half asleep, I called 911. I kept my voice quiet, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. She said a patrol car would swing by to check things out, probably within the next 15 to 20 minutes. As I hung up, I noticed something that made my legs feel weak. The side door to the garage, the one I'd checked twice, the one Mrs. Coleman warned me about, was standing slightly open, cold November air drifting into the kitchen. I grabbed Noah, who protested sleepily, and carried him to the powder room near the front entrance. It was the only room on the first floor with a lock on the door and no windows. I set him on the closed toilet seat. His dinosaur clutched against his chest and told him we were playing a game. Whoever could be the quietest would win a prize. His eyes were wide now, picking up on my fear despite my attempts to hide it. I locked the door and sat on the floor with my back against it, Noah in my lap, my phone in one hand with 911 ready to dial again. We could hear the house around us, the normal settling sounds that now seemed sinister, the hum of electronics, and then something else. Footsteps above us, slow and deliberate, moving through the second floor. Not the quick, light steps of someone searching, but measured, unhurried, like someone taking inventory. They moved from room to room, pausing occasionally. I could track their path. Noah's room first, then what must be the master bedroom, then the hallway bathroom. The toilet tank lid in our small bathroom could be used as a weapon if needed, I thought wildly, but I couldn't risk the noise of removing it. The footsteps stopped directly above us, and we heard drawers being opened and closed, not frantically but methodically. Noah pressed his face into my shoulder, his small body trembling, and I held him tighter, texting the 911 dispatcher with my free hand that someone was definitely in the house now. She told me units were 3 minutes out, to stay where I was, keep the door locked. 3 minutes feels like 3 hours when you're sitting in a bathroom with a terrified child, listening to a stranger walk through the house. The footsteps moved to the stairs, and we could hear each creak as he descended. 5th step, 4th, 3rd. I knew because I'd counted them earlier when carrying Noah up. He reached the bottom and paused. We could hear breathing on the other side of the bathroom door, heavy and slow. The doorknob turned once, testing. Then again, harder. Noah whimpered, and I pressed my hand gently over his mouth, tears running down both our faces. The man kicked the door once, hard enough to make the frame shake, and Noah's dinosaur fell to the floor with a soft thump. Then suddenly, beautifully, we heard sirens approaching, getting louder by the second. The footsteps retreated fast, running now, and we heard the side door slam. I stayed frozen in place, Noah still clutched against me, until I heard loud knocking and someone identifying themselves as police. Even then, I made them slip their badge under the bathroom door before I opened it. 2 officers were there, a younger guy with red hair and an older woman who immediately took charge. While the male officer searched the house and checked the perimeter, the woman sat with us in the living room, Noah on my lap, refusing to let go. She was patient and professional, taking my statement while keeping her voice soft enough not to further frighten Noah. The other officer came back and asked me to walk through the house with him to see if anything looked disturbed. In Noah's room, all his dresser drawers were open, clothes moved around but nothing obviously missing. The master bedroom was the same. Drawers opened, jewelry box on the dresser opened but still full, Mr. Coleman's watch still sitting on the nightstand. But in the small office at the end of the hall, we found what the intruder had been after. A filing cabinet was open, papers scattered on the desk, and the officer pointed out what I hadn't noticed. Several documents with social security numbers, bank statements, tax returns, everything someone would need for identity theft. The Colemans came home to a crime scene. Mrs. Coleman still in her burgundy dress, but now with a police jacket over her shoulders. Mascara streaked down her cheeks as she held Noah. The police found muddy footprints throughout the house. The intruder had been inside for at least 30 minutes before I'd locked us in the bathroom, walking through every room, even standing in the doorway of Noah's room while he slept. They found where he'd been watching from outside too, cigarette butts and footprints beneath several windows, suggesting he'd been there for hours before we even arrived, studying the house, waiting for the parents to leave. The side door lock was broken, looked like it had been for a while, just held closed by the deadbolt that I'd checked, but which could be jimmied open with a credit card. They never caught him, though the police said this matched a pattern of break-ins targeting houses with babysitters. Someone who knew teenage sitters would be less likely to confront them, more likely to hide with the children. Mrs. Coleman paid me triple what we'd agreed on and drove me home herself, apologizing over and over. I never babysat for a family I didn't know again, and even now, years later, I still check every lock twice and never sit with my back to a window. Most people think babysitting is easy money. Watch some kids, put them to bed, watch TV until the parents come home. I thought the same thing when I started doing it during my junior year of college. The extra cash helped with textbooks and rent for my cramped studio apartment near campus. It was a Saturday in early April when I got a call from the Waynes, a family I'd never worked for before. They'd gotten my number from another family I regularly sat for, the Johnsons. Mrs. Wayne sounded desperate on the phone. Their regular sitter had canceled last minute, and they had theater tickets they'd bought months in advance. She offered to pay double my usual rate if I could be there by 6. The money was too good to pass up, especially with finals coming up and my car needing new brakes. The Waynes lived in one of those pristine suburban developments where every house has the same mailbox, and the HOA sends you letters if your grass gets too long. Their house was a 2-story colonial with perfect white shutters and a wraparound porch that looked like something from a real estate magazine. Mr. Wayne answered the door wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my semester's tuition. He had this nervous energy about him, kept checking his watch and glancing back toward the stairs. Mrs. Wayne appeared behind him in a burgundy cocktail dress, her smile tight as she ushered me inside. They had 2 kids, she explained quickly. Lily, who was 7, and Ethan, who just turned 9. She mentioned Ethan could be a handful sometimes, but assured me both kids usually went to bed without much fuss. Something about the way Mr. Wayne's jaw tightened when she said Ethan's name should have been my first warning. After the parents left in a rush of perfume and car keys, I found Lily in the living room coloring at the coffee table. She had these huge brown eyes and kept her crayons organized by color in perfect rows. When I introduced myself, she barely looked up, just whispered hi, and went back to her drawing. I asked where her brother was, and she got this strange look on her face, like she was trying to decide whether to tell me something important. "He's in his room," she finally said, then added in an even quieter voice, "He's not supposed to come out until dinner." That struck me as odd. What 9-year-old gets sent to their room before the babysitter even arrives? I told her I'd go introduce myself to him, but she grabbed my wrist with her small hand. "Don't," she said, and there was something in her voice that made me pause. "Just wait until dinner, please." Her grip was surprisingly strong for such a little kid, and I noticed old scratches on her arms, some faded and some still pink. I decided to respect what seemed like a family rule, and stayed downstairs with Lily while she colored. She was drawing a house, but all the windows were colored in black, and there were no people in the picture. Around 6:30, I started making dinner. Mrs. Wayne had left instructions for mac and cheese and chicken nuggets. While the water was boiling, I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway, and my first thought was how normal he looked. Sandy brown hair that stuck up in the back, freckles across his nose, wearing a dinosaur t-shirt and jeans. He had this wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, which were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost gray. "You must be the new babysitter," he said, and something about hearing such formal words from a 9-year-old felt wrong. He walked past me to the counter and picked up a knife from the block, turning it over in his hands like he was examining it. "We're not supposed to touch those," I said, keeping my voice light and friendly. He looked at me for a long moment, still holding the knife, before setting it down with a deliberate click against the granite. During dinner, Ethan sat directly across from me while Lily picked at her food beside him. He ate his chicken nuggets by tearing them apart with his fingers first, examining the inside before eating each piece. "Did you know," he said suddenly, "that chickens can live for 18 months without a head? There was this one chicken named Mike who survived after my grandpa chopped his head off for dinner." He smiled at Lily when he said this, and she pushed her plate away. I tried to change the subject, asking about school and friends, but Ethan kept steering the conversation back to disturbing topics. How long different animals could survive without air, what happens to bodies when they decompose, whether I'd ever seen something die. Lily excused herself to use the bathroom, and as soon as she left, Ethan leaned forward. "Want to see something cool in the basement?" he asked. When I said maybe later, his expression shifted just for a second to something darker. "Lily showed you her scratches, didn't she? She's so dramatic. She doesn't understand that sometimes you have to hurt things to see how they work." The moment Lily came back, she must have sensed the tension because she immediately asked if we could watch a movie. I agreed quickly, grateful for the distraction, and we moved to the living room. Lily sat pressed against my side on the couch while Ethan took the armchair across from us, never taking his eyes off me even as the movie played. About halfway through, I heard a sound from upstairs, a high-pitched squeak followed by a thump. "That's just Mr. Whiskers," Lily said quickly, but her whole body had gone rigid. "Our cat," she added when she saw my confusion. Ethan stood up slowly, that same inappropriate smile spreading across his face. "I should check on him," he said. "He hasn't been feeling well." Lily's fingers dug into my arm and she whispered, "Don't let him go up there alone." But Ethan was already heading for the stairs, and when I stood to follow, he turned and said in this perfectly calm voice, "I really think you should stay with Lily. She gets scared when she's alone." The way he said it wasn't a suggestion. I stayed with Lily for about 5 minutes before the sounds from upstairs got worse. A series of thuds, and then what sounded like the cat screaming. Lily was crying now, silent tears running down her face, and I'd had enough. I told her to stay on the couch and headed for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. The hallway was dark, but I could see light coming from under a door at the end. When I pushed it open, I found Ethan in what must have been his parents' bedroom. Mr. Whiskers was on the bed, and Ethan was holding him down with one hand while holding something small and sharp in the other. It looked like a compass from a geometry set. The cat was struggling, and there were already several small red spots on its white fur. "Put him down," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Ethan looked up at me with those pale eyes, tilting his head like I was the one doing something strange. "I'm just conducting an experiment," he said. "Don't you want to know how much pressure it takes before they stop moving?" I stepped forward and grabbed the cat, who immediately scratched my arms in panic before running out of the room. Ethan stood up slowly, still holding the compass, and for the first time I felt genuinely afraid of a 9-year-old child. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, walking toward me with measured steps. "Now the experiment is ruined. We'll have to start over with something else." I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on him, but he moved faster than I expected, darting forward and catching my wrist. His grip was shockingly strong, and when he pressed the compass point against my palm, just enough to indent the skin, he watched my face with scientific curiosity. "Does this hurt?" he asked. "Rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. I yanked my hand away and pushed past him, heading back downstairs where Lily was still curled up on the couch. My mind was racing. Should I call the parents, the police? This kid clearly needed serious help, but what would I even say? That a 9-year-old was creeping me out? I decided to call Mrs. Wayne, but when I picked up my phone, I realized it wasn't where I'd left it on the kitchen counter. "Looking for this?" Ethan's voice came from behind me. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs holding my phone. "I think we should play a game first." "Lily loves games, don't you, Lily?" His sister shrank further into the couch cushions, and I knew this was about to get much worse. "Give me my phone, Ethan," I said, trying to sound authoritative despite my racing heart. He tossed it in the air and caught it, then suddenly threw it hard against the wall where it shattered into pieces. The sound made Lily whimper. "Oops," he said flatly. "Guess you can't call anyone now." He walked into the kitchen, and I heard drawers opening and closing. When he came back, he was carrying the knife from earlier, the one he'd been examining before dinner. "Did you know that the human body has about 37 trillion cells?" he said conversationally, running his finger along the flat of the blade. "I read that each one dies and regenerates at different rates. Skin cells last about 2 weeks. Red blood cells last 4 months. But brain cells, some of those last your whole lifetime, unless something happens to them." He took a step toward us and I pulled Lily behind me. "We're leaving," I said, grabbing Lily's hand and moving toward the front door, but Ethan was quick, positioning himself between us and the exit. "The game isn't over yet," he said, "and nobody leaves until I say so." That's when Lily did something I didn't expect. She bit Ethan's arm hard enough to make him drop the knife. "Run!" she screamed, and we bolted toward the back door in the kitchen. I could hear Ethan behind us, not running but walking with those same measured steps, like he knew we couldn't really escape. The back door was locked with a deadbolt that needed a key from the inside. Mrs. Wayne hadn't shown me where they kept it. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing his arm where Lily had bitten him. "That really hurt, Lily," he said calmly. "You know what happens when you hurt me?" Lily was sobbing now, pressing herself against the door. I grabbed a chair and held it between us and Ethan like a shield. "The Brenners next door," Lily whispered to me. "They have a key. Their backyard connects to ours through the gate." Ethan heard her and shook his head slowly. "You're not supposed to tell secrets, Lily. Now I'll have to punish both of you." He picked up the knife from where it had fallen, and I made a decision. I threw the chair at him as hard as I could, grabbed Lily, and ran for the sliding glass door in the dining room. The glass door was unlocked, thank God, and we burst into the backyard just as I heard the chair crash behind us. The Waynes' backyard was huge and dark, with a pool covered for the season, and garden beds along the fence. Lily pointed to a gate in the far corner, barely visible in the moonlight, and we ran toward it, my bare feet slipping on the wet grass. Behind us, the sliding door opened with a soft whoosh. "You can't run forever," Ethan called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "And when I catch you, we're going to play a different game. One where Lily gets to watch what happens when you don't follow the rules." The gate was locked with a simple latch that I fumbled with in the darkness, my fingers numb with fear. Finally, it clicked open and we stumbled into the Brenners' yard. Their house was lit up like a Christmas tree, every window glowing, and I could see someone moving in the kitchen. We ran to their back door and I pounded on it with both fists, probably looking insane. A college girl with scratched arms and no shoes, dragging a crying 7-year-old. Mrs. Brenner opened the door, an older woman with silver hair pulled back in a bun, and her eyes went wide when she saw us. "Call 911, I gasped out. "Please, just call 911 now." She didn't hesitate, immediately grabbing her phone from the counter while ushering us inside. Mr. Brenner appeared from the living room, and when I told them Ethan was dangerous and had a knife, his face went pale. "We've been worried about that boy," he said quietly. "Found our dog last month." "Never mind. Martha, tell them to hurry." We could see the Waynes' backyard from their kitchen window, and Ethan was standing by the gate, still holding the knife, just staring at the Brenners' house. He didn't try to come through the gate, just stood there watching. And somehow that was more terrifying than if he'd chased us. The police arrived within 10 minutes, the longest 10 minutes of my life, and 2 officers went to the Waynes' house while 1 stayed to take our statements. Lily finally told them everything, how Ethan had been hurting her for months, killing neighborhood pets, threatening her if she told anyone. She showed them older scars I hadn't noticed before. neat little cuts on her legs that he'd made her hide with long pants. The parents came home about an hour later to find police cars and an ambulance in their driveway. Mrs. Wayne broke down completely when the officers told her what had happened, but Mr. Wayne just stood there, with this hollow look, like he'd been expecting this call his whole life. Ethan was taken for psychiatric evaluation that night. I later learned from Mrs. Johnson, the family who'd recommended me, that he'd been diagnosed with conduct disorder and possible antisocial personality disorder. Fancy terms for what everyone in that neighborhood now knew was a deeply disturbed child who'd been escalating for years. The Waynes moved away 3 months later, but I kept in touch with the officer who'd taken my statement. He told me Ethan was placed in a specialized residential treatment facility after they found journals in his room documenting everything he'd done to animals and his plans for bigger experiments. Lily went to live with her grandmother in another state while her parents dealt with the legal and medical fallout. She sent me a letter once, about a year later, thanking me for getting her out that night. She said she was doing better, making friends, and didn't have to lock her bedroom door anymore. I never babysat again after that night. I work in an office now. Nice boring data entry where the worst thing that happens is the printer jams. Sometimes I still think about Ethan's pale eyes and that clinical curiosity in his voice when he asked me to rate my pain. But mostly I think about Lily, hoping she's somewhere safe, finally able to be just a normal kid who doesn't have to live in fear of her own brother. Last winter, I was between jobs when my sister Laura asked if I could watch her boys for a week while she attended a conference in Phoenix. I just finished my teaching degree but hadn't landed a position yet, so the timing worked out perfectly. Her twins, Mason and Lucas, were 12 years old, and I figured it would be easy money. Just make sure they ate dinner, did their homework, and got to bed on time. Laura's house sat at the end of Pinewood Avenue, one of those quiet suburban streets where nothing ever happens, where the biggest drama is usually someone's lawn getting too tall. The boys had always been a little odd, quieter than most kids their age, but I chalked it up to them being bookish types who preferred screens to sports. They had this way of staring at you without blinking for just a beat too long, and they'd often finish each other's sentences in a way that made you wonder if they practiced their conversations beforehand. The first few days went smoothly enough, though I noticed they spent every free moment huddled together on the couch with their tablets, earbuds in, completely absorbed in whatever they were watching. When I asked what had them so captivated, Mason looked up with these bright, eager eyes and said they were learning about real investigations and how crimes actually work. Lucas chimed in that their science teacher had gotten them interested in forensics, and now they were watching everything they could find about famous cases and criminal psychology. At dinner, instead of talking about video games or school friends like normal kids, they'd discuss blood spatter patterns and how long it takes for bruises to form on different skin types. They knew details about cases I'd never even heard of, obscure murders from the 1970s, techniques used by serial killers to avoid detection, how investigators sometimes missed crucial evidence. The way they talked about violence was clinical, detached, like they were discussing the rules of chess rather than actual human suffering. On the fourth night, a Tuesday, I caught them in the garage after bedtime, examining Laura's tool collection with flashlights. Mason was holding a length of rope, while Lucas measured it against his own height, muttering numbers under his breath. When I flicked on the overhead light, they didn't even startle, just turned to look at me with those unnervingly calm expressions. "We're doing a project," Lucas explained, wrapping the rope into neat loops like he'd practiced the motion 100 times. "About knots and their tensile strength." Mason added that they'd learned about different binding techniques used throughout history, how certain knots were impossible to escape from if done correctly. They showed me a notebook filled with detailed sketches of various knot patterns, complete with annotations about pounds of pressure and circulation cutoff times. Something about the precision of their drawings, The methodical way they documented each configuration made my chest feel tight. That same night, after I'd sent them back to their rooms, I found their browser history on the family computer. Page after page of true crime forums, autopsy reports that should have been behind age restrictions, detailed discussions about how long a person could survive without oxygen, water, food. They'd bookmarked a thread titled, "Mistakes That Got Them Caught," with over 300 replies analyzing where criminals had gone wrong. One tab was still open to a video transcript of a killer describing exactly how he'd subdued his victims, step by step, like a cooking recipe. The boys had left comments under fake usernames, asking specific questions about restraint methods and how to prevent someone from screaming. User Twin Study 1 had written, "But wouldn't duct tape leave residue? What about using cloth instead?" The response from another user explained exactly how to muffle sound without leaving forensic evidence. My mouth went dry reading their exchanges, seeing how other users praised their thorough research and attention to detail. I should have called Laura right then, should have packed my things and left, but I kept telling myself they were just curious kids with a morbid fascination. Lots of people watch true crime shows, right? The next morning, Wednesday, they seemed completely normal at breakfast, talking about a math test and asking if we could order pizza for dinner. Mason even smiled when I agreed, a genuine kid smile that made me doubt everything I'd seen the night before. But throughout the day, I kept catching these moments. Lucas timing how long it took me to get from the kitchen to the front door, Mason testing which floorboards creaked in the hallway, both of them watching me when they thought I wasn't looking. After lunch, I found them in the basement with Laura's old camcorder, filming each other practice approaching someone from behind. "It's for a school presentation," Lucas said when I asked, but their teacher had sent home a newsletter that week, and there was nothing about any presentations. By Wednesday evening, the atmosphere in the house had shifted into something I can't quite describe, like the air before a thunderstorm, charged and heavy. The boys kept exchanging these meaningful looks across the dinner table, and I noticed they'd barely touched their pizza, despite specifically requesting it. Around 8 o'clock, Mason asked if I wanted to watch a movie with them. Something about his voice too eager, too rehearsed. Lucas was already setting up the living room, moving the coffee table aside to create more floor space, positioning the couch cushions in a specific arrangement that seemed oddly deliberate. They'd closed all the curtains even though it was still light outside, and I saw Lucas slip something into his pocket when he thought I was looking at the TV. The movie they'd chosen was some obscure thriller about a home invasion, and they kept pausing it to discuss the techniques the criminals were using, asking me what I would do in that situation, how I would try to escape. About halfway through the movie, Lucas said he was cold and went to get blankets. Mason stayed unnaturally still beside me, his breathing deliberately steady like he was counting each inhale and exhale. When Lucas returned, he had an armful of sheets and blankets, way more than we needed, and that rope from the garage tucked underneath. Before I could react, Mason grabbed my wrists with surprising strength while Lucas threw a sheet over my head. The coordination was perfect. They'd clearly rehearsed this. I tried to stand, but Mason hooked his leg behind my knees, a move he must have seen in one of those videos, and I went down hard on the carpet. Lucas was already wrapping the rope around my ankles with those precise knots he'd been practicing, talking to Mason in this calm, instructional voice. "Remember, 3 loops minimum, just like the forum said." My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst as I felt them securing my wrists behind my back with what felt like zip ties they'd hidden in the couch cushions. The sheet came off my head once they had me restrained, and I saw they'd lit dozens of candles around the room. When had they even done that? The flickering light made their faces look older, sharper, and they were both wearing latex gloves they must have taken from under the kitchen sink. Mason had a notebook in his hand, reading from it like a script. Subject appears distressed, pulse visibly elevated in carotid artery, initial restraints holding as expected. Lucas was setting up the camcorder on a tripod, adjusting the angle to capture everything. They weren't playing anymore. This was methodical, systematic, like they were conducting an actual experiment with me as their test subject. We read that fear responses peak within the first 15 minutes, Lucas explained, pulling out a kitchen timer and setting it on the mantel. We want to document the physiological changes, pupil dilation, perspiration, vocal patterns. Mason approached with a flashlight, shining it directly in my eyes while Lucas took notes about my reaction. The smell of all those candles was overwhelming, vanilla and cinnamon mixing into something that made me nauseous. When I tried to scream, they didn't panic or rush to silence me like you'd expect from kids who'd gotten in over their heads. Instead, Lucas calmly checked his watch and made a note. Vocalization attempt at minute 3. Volume approximately 70 decibels based on our prior measurements. Mason pulled out an iPad and showed me a sound meter app they'd been using to test how far screams could travel from inside the house. The Petersons next door can't hear anything under 85 decibels, he informed me matter-of-factly. We tested it last weekend when they were home. They'd thought of everything, researched everything, prepared for every contingency like tiny criminal masterminds. Lucas produced a ball of cloth, one of my own socks, I realized, and held it near my face. Phase 2 involves testing gag effectiveness, he announced to the camera. We've compared different materials and insertion methods based on emergency room data about choking hazards. The clinical way he said it, like he was presenting a science fair project, made bile rise in my throat. They spent the next hour running through what they called their protocol, taking turns reading from their notebooks and making adjustments to my restraints. Every few minutes, they'd stop to take my pulse, checking it against some chart they'd printed from a medical website. Mason had brought down a blood pressure cuff from Laura's bathroom and was trying to figure out how to use it properly, while Lucas critiqued his technique based on a YouTube tutorial they'd watched. They documented everything: how long it took for the zip ties to leave marks, which positions caused the most discomfort, how my breathing changed when they tightened certain knots. At one point, Lucas mentioned they'd found a website that explained how crime scene investigators could determine the timeline of events based on bruising patterns and ligature marks. We're being careful not to cause permanent damage, he assured the camera, as if that somehow made this better. The kitchen timer kept going off every 15 minutes, and they'd reset it and move to the next phase of whatever sick experiment they were conducting. One of the candles near the window had burned down dangerously low, wax pooling on the wooden side table Laura had inherited from her grandmother. The boys were so focused on their research that they didn't notice when that candle finally tipped over, the pooled wax catching the lace doily underneath. The flame spread to the curtain's edge while Mason was busy adjusting the camera angle, and Lucas was writing observations about my stress indicators. It wasn't until smoke started filling the room that they looked up from their notebooks, and I saw real panic flash across their faces for the first time all night. The smoke detector started shrieking just as Lucas tried to stamp out the growing fire with a couch cushion, which only made things worse. Mason ran to the kitchen for water but knocked over 3 more candles in his rush, and suddenly the room was chaos. Smoke everywhere, multiple small fires starting, the boys coughing and stumbling over their equipment. Through the window, I could see lights turning on at the Petersons' house, then the Ngoyans across the street. The twins were trying to untie me when we heard the sirens, their practiced calm completely shattered as they fumbled with the knots they'd so carefully crafted. Lucas was crying, saying, "We didn't mean for this part to happen," over and over, while Mason tried to cut the zip ties with safety scissors that weren't strong enough. The firefighters broke down the door just as the boys managed to get the rope off my ankles. I'll never forget the look on the lead firefighter's face when he took in the scene. Me still partially tied up, the camera on its tripod, the notebooks full of their observations scattered on the floor, and these 2 12-year-old boys in latex gloves standing over me with scissors. The police arrived minutes later, and while the paramedics checked me over, I watched the officers flip through those notebooks, their expressions growing more disturbed with each page. The boys kept trying to explain that it was just research, that they were going to let me go after they collected enough data, that they'd calculated everything to be safe within acceptable parameters. The officer who took my statement, A woman named Detective Ramirez told me they'd found over 40 hours of true crime content on the boys' devices, plus correspondence with adult users on those forums who'd been encouraging their curiosity. Laura had to fly home that night, and I spent 3 hours at the hospital getting photographed and examined, while she sobbed in the waiting room. The boys ended up in a psychiatric facility for evaluation, and the last I heard, they were in intensive therapy. I still have scars on my wrists from those zip ties, thin white lines that remind me how close I came to being a statistic in someone else's true crime obsession. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The smell hit me the second I stepped out of my unmarked Crown Vic at the storage facility on Milwaukee's industrial side. August heat made everything worse, turning the air thick and heavy like breathing through wet cloth. I'd been a detective for 15 years, seen plenty of decomposition cases, but this was different somehow. The manager who'd called us, Frank something or other with tobacco-stained teeth and a permanent squint, was already waiting by the office door, sweating through his shirt despite the early afternoon breeze. He kept wiping his palms on his jeans and wouldn't make eye contact for more than a second at a time. My partner had called in sick that morning with food poisoning from bad sushi, leaving me to handle what dispatch described as complaints about an odor at this place wedged between an abandoned textile factory and a scrapyard where nobody asked questions. Frank led me through rows of orange metal doors, each one identical except for the fading numbers painted in white. Unit 47B sat at the end of a corridor, far from the main entrance where most renters kept their stuff. He told me the renter was some guy named Christopher Vaughn, who'd been paying cash 3 months in advance for the past 8 months, never missed a payment, never caused trouble until about 3 weeks ago when other renters started complaining. The smell got stronger with each step we took toward that unit, and I noticed Frank had stopped about 30 feet away, fumbling with his master keys while trying not to breathe through his nose. Dead pigeons lined the concrete near the unit's door, and flies buzzed in thick clouds despite the industrial-strength pest control the facility supposedly used monthly. When Frank finally got the padlock off, his hands trembling so bad he dropped the keys twice, I told him to step back and call for backup. The metal door rolled up with a grinding screech that echoed through the corridor, and what I saw inside made me understand why those pigeons had died. The unit was bigger than expected, maybe 10 by 20 feet, lined wall to wall with chest freezers. 7 of them, all humming with electricity, all duct-taped shut around the edges like someone really didn't want them opened accidentally. The smell was overwhelming now, sweet and rotten and chemical all at once, like meat left in formaldehyde under the sun. Each freezer had a label maker strip across the front with dates going back months, some kind of coding system I couldn't immediately understand. Between the freezers were boxes of medical supplies, the kind you'd see in a hospital storage room. Surgical gloves, scalpels still in sterile packaging, bone saws, and bottles of chemicals with names I'd need a medical degree to pronounce. I pulled out my phone to call it in, but the signal was weak in the metal building, so I had to step outside. While I waited for the crime scene unit and additional officers, I asked Frank about Christopher Vaughn. He pulled out a rental agreement from a manila folder he'd been clutching, showing me a photocopy of a driver's license. The photo showed a thin man, maybe 35, with hollowed cheeks and eyes that seemed to stare through the camera rather than at it. Frank mentioned Vaughn always came at odd hours, usually after midnight or before dawn, always alone, always carrying black garbage bags that looked heavy. The other renters had started complaining about the smell 3 weeks ago, but Frank admitted he'd noticed something weird months earlier, when he'd seen Vaughn wheeling in what looked like restaurant equipment on a dolly at 3 a.m. The first unit arrived within 15 minutes. 2 patrol officers who immediately called for hazmat when they caught the smell. We established a perimeter while waiting for the crime scene techs, and I started running Vaughn's name through the system on my laptop in the car. What came back made my chest tighten. Christopher Eugene Vaughn, expelled from Northwestern's medical school 6 years ago for stealing cadavers from the anatomy lab. He'd been caught performing unauthorized procedures on bodies meant for student education, keeping detailed notes about decomposition rates and preservation methods. The university had pressed charges, but they were dropped when Vaughn agreed to psychiatric treatment. His last known address was his mother's house in Kenosha, but she'd reported him missing 2 years ago, said he'd become obsessed with something he called understanding the transition, and stopped taking his medication. By the time the crime scene unit arrived in full hazmat gear, we'd evacuated the entire facility and set up a command post in the parking lot. The lead tech, a woman named Diane, who'd worked scenes with me before, went in first with a camera while I watched the feed on a monitor they'd set up. When she cut through the duct tape on the first freezer and lifted the lid, even through the grainy video feed, I could see her whole body recoil. Inside, wrapped in clear plastic like cuts of meat at a butcher shop, were human remains in various stages of dismemberment. Arms separated at the joints, organs in sealed bags with labels indicating weights and dates, everything arranged with a precision that made it clear this wasn't random violence. Diane's voice crackled through the radio, professional but strained, confirming what we could all see. We were dealing with multiple victims. Over the next 4 hours, the team documented everything while I coordinated with headquarters. Each freezer told its own horrible story. The second one contained what appeared to be complete skeletons, cleaned and numbered with tiny metal tags like museum specimens. The third had organs floating in jars of preservation fluid, each container meticulously labeled with extraction dates, body weights, and what looked like medical observations written in cramped handwriting. Diane found notebooks stacked between the freezers, hundreds of pages of detailed notes about decomposition rates, tissue preservation, and crude autopsy techniques. Vaughn had been teaching himself, using stolen bodies as practice. The medical examiner who arrived later identified at least 12 distinct individuals based on preliminary examination, though she warned the actual number could be higher. Most appeared to be bodies stolen from morgues and funeral homes across 3 states, matching reports of missing corpses that had been filed over the past 8 months. The breakthrough came when one of the techs found a laptop hidden behind the 7th freezer, still logged into Vaughn's email account. He'd been corresponding with black market dealers, people who sold medical specimens to underground collectors and unlicensed research facilities. But the emails showed he'd never actually sold anything. Instead, he kept writing about perfecting his technique, about understanding death in a way medical school never taught. One email to a potential buyer, dated just 5 days ago, said he was close to something important, that he'd discovered patterns in decomposition that nobody else had documented. The laptop also contained hundreds of photos, each showing different stages of his work. Faces blurred out, but everything else in sharp, clinical detail. There were spreadsheets tracking everything from ambient temperature to humidity levels in the storage unit, treating the whole thing like some twisted scientific experiment. We tracked Vaughn down through his credit card. Despite paying for the storage unit in cash, he'd been stupid enough to use his Visa at a motel about 40 miles north, near the state line. The place was one of those pay-by-the-week dumps where nobody asked questions, and the carpets hadn't been cleaned since the 90s. Local police surrounded room 23 just after sunset, and I was there when they breached the door. Vaughn didn't resist. He was sitting at a desk made of particle board, writing in another notebook surrounded by medical textbooks and printed articles about decomposition. He looked nothing like his driver's license photo anymore. His hair had grown past his shoulders, greasy and tangled, and he'd lost so much weight his clothes hung off him like they belonged to someone else. His fingernails were long and dirty, with what looked like dried blood underneath them. When I read him his rights, He just nodded and asked if we'd found his work, said it was important that someone preserved his research. During the interrogation, Vaughn was disturbingly calm, speaking about the bodies like a professor discussing lab specimens. He admitted to everything but seemed genuinely confused why we were treating it as a crime. He explained how he'd gotten the bodies, bribing night shift workers at funeral homes, breaking into morgues using stolen key cards, sometimes taking bodies that were meant for cremation so they wouldn't be missed immediately. He'd been practicing autopsies, teaching himself what medical school had denied him, documenting everything because he believed he was contributing to science. When I asked him about the families of these people, about the violation of human dignity, he tilted his head like I was speaking a foreign language. He said the dead didn't care, that they were just organic matter reorganizing itself, and that his work would help future medical students understand decomposition better than any textbook. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and I testified on the second day. Vaughn's lawyer tried for an insanity plea, bringing in psychiatrists who diagnosed him with severe delusional disorder and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. But the jury saw through it. The meticulous planning, the careful selection of victims who wouldn't be immediately missed, the elaborate concealment methods, it all pointed to someone who knew exactly what they were doing was wrong. He got life without parole, though he never stopped insisting he was a researcher, not a criminal. The storage facility was demolished 6 months later after the owner couldn't rent a single unit. Frank quit the day we found everything and moved to Florida, said he couldn't stop smelling that stench even after the place was cleaned. The families of the identified bodies finally got closure, could finally have proper burials, though some remains were too damaged to ever be returned. I retired 2 years after the Vaughn case, earlier than I'd planned. Not because of fear or trauma, but because something fundamental had shifted in how I saw the job. In 15 years, I'd investigated murders driven by rage, greed, jealousy, emotions I could at least understand even if I condemned them. But Vaughn's complete detachment, his ability to see human bodies as nothing more than study materials, left me with questions I couldn't answer. Sometimes I still get calls from journalists wanting to write about the case, especially around the anniversary. I always decline. What haunts me isn't the horror of what we found in that storage unit, but Vaughn's genuine belief that he was doing something valuable. The last thing he said to me, as they led him away in shackles, was that someone would continue his work someday. That knowledge couldn't be suppressed forever. I hope he's wrong, but sometimes late at night, I wonder if there's someone else out there, in another storage unit or basement carrying on where he left off. I'm Detective Ellen Carter, and I've been with the police force in a small Colorado town for about 12 years now. It was a Monday morning in early September 2022 when everything changed for me. I'd just gotten back from a week-long vacation with my husband and our 2 kids, feeling refreshed and ready to dive back into what I thought would be another routine week of petty thefts and noise complaints. Our town had always been one of those places where people left their doors unlocked and kids played in the streets until dark. I was sitting at my desk, catching up on paperwork and sipping the terrible coffee from the break room machine, when dispatch called about a welfare check on Cedar Lane. Mrs. Thompson hadn't shown up for her weekly book club, and her friends were worried because she never missed a meeting, not even when she had pneumonia 2 winters ago. Cedar Lane was one of those picture-perfect suburban streets with matching mailboxes and well-maintained lawns that looked like they belonged in a real estate magazine. I drove there alone since my partner was testifying in court that day, figuring it would be a quick check. Probably find Mrs. Thompson had fallen asleep watching TV, or maybe taken an unexpected trip to visit her daughter in Denver. The Thompson house was a modest 2-story with pale yellow siding and a wraparound porch decorated with hanging baskets of petunias that were starting to wilt in the late summer heat. When I knocked and got no answer, I noticed the front door was actually slightly ajar. Just a crack, like someone had tried to close it but the latch hadn't caught properly. The mail from Saturday was still sticking out of the mailbox, and there was a package from Amazon sitting on the porch that looked like it had been there for at least a couple of days, based on the water stains from the sprinkler system. I pushed the door open with my shoulder, announcing myself loudly as I stepped inside. The house smelled weird, not like death. I knew that smell too well from my years on the force, but something chemical mixed with the lingering aroma of cooked food. The living room looked completely normal. TV remote on the coffee table next to a half-finished crossword puzzle, and reading glasses. But when I walked through to the dining room, that's when I saw her. Mrs. Thompson was sitting perfectly upright in her chair at the head of the table, facing a full plate of what looked like roast chicken, with mashed potatoes and green beans. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and her eyes were closed like she'd just dozed off during dinner. The food hadn't been touched. The butter pad on the potatoes hadn't even melted, and there was still steam condensation on the inside of the water glass, which told me this meal had been served recently, maybe within the last day or two. I checked for a pulse, even though her skin had that waxy gray tint that meant she'd been gone for at least 24 hours. The positioning was what bothered me most. Nobody dies naturally sitting that perfectly straight, with their hands folded like they're posing for a family portrait. I called it in immediately, requesting backup and the coroner, then started examining the scene more carefully without touching anything. The kitchen showed signs of normal meal preparation: dirty pots in the sink, vegetable peelings in the trash, a cookbook still open to a recipe for herb-roasted chicken. But there was also a clipboard on the counter with what looked like a work order from Riverside Utilities, dated 3 days prior, signed by someone named Jason Brennan, with a note about checking the gas lines for the neighborhood modernization project. I photographed everything with my phone while waiting for the crime scene unit, and that's when I noticed something else strange. There was a second place setting at the table, directly across from Mrs. Thompson, but that plate was completely clean, like someone had eaten their entire meal and even wiped the plate with bread. While the forensics team processed the Thompson house, I decided to canvass the neighborhood to see if anyone had noticed this utility worker or anything unusual over the past few days. The first neighbor I talked to was Mr. Gallagher, a retired postal worker who lived directly across the street and was known for sitting on his porch most afternoons. He mentioned seeing a white van with Riverside Utilities painted on the side, parked in front of several houses on the street earlier in the week. But he hadn't thought much of it since there had been notices about infrastructure updates posted on everyone's doors the previous month. He described the worker as a clean-cut guy, maybe mid-30s, wearing the typical blue uniform and carrying a toolbox and clipboard. What stuck with Mr. Gallagher was how friendly the guy was, stopping to chat with everyone, asking about their families, even helped Mrs. Ningian carry her groceries in when he saw her struggling with the bags. That's when Mrs. Gallagher mentioned something that made my chest tighten with dread. She said their next-door neighbors, the Andersons, hadn't been seen since Saturday, and their newspaper was piling up on the driveway. The Andersons were a couple in their 60s who kept to themselves, but were reliable about maintaining their property. Their garage door was still open with both cars inside, which was completely out of character for them. I radioed for additional units immediately, and headed to the Anderson house with 2 officers who had just arrived as backup. The front door was locked, but when we went around back, we found the sliding glass door to the kitchen unlocked. The smell hit us immediately, that same chemical odor mixed with food, but stronger this time. In the dining room, we found Mr. and Mrs. Anderson seated at opposite ends of their table, both in that same unnaturally upright position, both with untouched plates of food in front of them. Looked like spaghetti with meat sauce, salad on the side, glasses of red wine that had never been sipped. The Andersons had the same clipboard on their kitchen counter, same Riverside Utilities letterhead, same signature from Jason Brennan, dated the day before Mrs. Thompson's visit. But this time I found something else. A business card tucked under a magnet on their refrigerator with the Riverside Utilities logo, and a phone number. When I called it from my cell, I got a disconnected number message. The real Riverside Utilities, when we contacted them, had no record of any Jason Brennan. no scheduled maintenance on Cedar Lane, and their official vans were accounted for in their fleet. They also confirmed their workers wore orange uniforms, not blue, and they never did door-to-door visits without sending official letters at least 2 weeks in advance. The forensics photographer was documenting everything when one of the officers found something in the Andersons' trash, an empty box of fancy chocolates with a thank you note that read, "For being such wonderful neighbors, Jason from Riverside Utilities." By this point, we had the entire street blocked off and were going door to door. Most residents were at work, but the retirees and stay-at-home parents were all accounted for and safe, though shaken when we explained what was happening. Then we got to the Washburn house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Joyce Washburn was a widow in her 70s, who lived alone and was known for her incredible garden and homemade jam that she gave out every Christmas. Her car was in the driveway. Her sprinklers were running on schedule, but she wasn't answering the door. The neighbor had a spare key. They checked on each other regularly. And when we entered, I already knew what we'd find. There she was, seated at her small kitchen table with a bowl of soup and a sandwich in front of her, untouched, hands folded, that same terrible upright posture. The clipboard was there too, but this time there was also a plate of cookies on the counter with a handwritten note. "Joyce, thank you for the lovely chat and lemonade. Enjoy these as a small token of appreciation. JB." The medical examiner arrived within the hour and did preliminary tests on Mrs. Thompson while we waited. He found no obvious signs of violence or struggle, but noted petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes and a slight blue tinge around her lips that suggested poisoning. The way he explained it to me, certain toxins could cause respiratory paralysis while keeping the victim conscious and aware for several minutes, long enough for someone to position them however they wanted. The thought of these poor people being unable to move or call for help while this monster arranged them like dolls at their own dinner tables made me physically sick. I had to step outside for a minute to compose myself, and that's when I saw something that everyone else had missed. Fresh tire tracks in the mud beside Joyce Washburn's driveway, where her sprinklers had overwatered the edge of the lawn. The tracks were distinctive. Heavy vehicle, probably a van, with what looked like a nail or screw embedded in the rear left tire that left a small puncture mark every rotation. We immediately put out a bolo for any white van with Riverside Utilities markings and that specific tire damage. I spent the rest of that day and most of the night interviewing neighbors, reviewing security footage from the few houses that had cameras, and trying to piece together this Jason Brennan's movements. The security footage we did get showed him clearly. Average height, brown hair, clean-shaven, probably around 35, wearing that blue uniform and always carrying the same black toolbox and clipboard. He had this way of walking with a slight bounce in his step, almost cheerful, and in one video you could see him whistling while he walked up to the Andersons' door. What really got to me was how normal he looked, how he smiled and waved at a kid riding by on a bicycle, how he stopped to pet someone's dog. He spent between 30 and 45 minutes in each house, and in every case, he was the last person seen entering before the victims were found dead. The breakthrough came around 3 a.m. when an officer found the van abandoned in a grocery store parking lot about 15 miles away. It had been set on fire, but the rain from that evening had put it out before it was completely destroyed. The VIN number had been filed off, but our forensics team found partial prints on a water bottle in the cab and DNA on a cigarette butt. The toolbox was still in the back, containing vials of what turned out to be succinylcholine, a paralytic drug used in hospitals that's incredibly hard to get without medical credentials, mixed with a slow-acting poison that would kill within hours. There were also stacks of fake business cards, several blue uniforms, and most disturbing of all, a notebook with addresses and details about dozens of elderly residents across 3 states, with Cedar Lane being just one of many streets marked with red check marks. Mrs. Thompson, the Andersons, and Joyce Washburn all had stars next to their names with notes like "Lives Alone," "Trusting," and "Offers Refreshments." We ran the prints and DNA through every database we had access to, and got a hit 6 hours later. The man calling himself Jason Brennan was actually Gregory Hoffman, a former hospice nurse who'd lost his license 5 years earlier for stealing medications and who had a history of financial fraud targeting elderly patients. He'd been moving across the Midwest, hitting small towns where people still trusted strangers in uniforms, where elderly folks living alone would open their doors to a friendly utility worker, warning about gas leaks or offering free safety inspections. We caught him 2 days later at a motel in Nebraska, preparing to hit another neighborhood. He'd already distributed flyers and made initial contact with several potential victims. When we arrested him, he was calm, almost proud, and the only thing he said was that he'd been helping them avoid the indignity of dying alone in nursing homes. He's now serving 3 life sentences, but I know there are more victims out there we haven't found yet. I still drive by Cedar Lane sometimes, and even though new families have moved into those houses, I can't forget how I found those people, posed at their tables like some sick art installation, their last meals growing cold in front of them. The body cam footage was supposed to be routine review, just another Monday morning task at the Phoenix precinct where I'd been working as a detective. At 32, with 8 years in uniform behind me and 6 months in my new position, I thought I'd seen most of what this job had to offer. My desk was buried under case files from a string of burglaries that had been plaguing the wealthy neighborhoods on the north side. Empty coffee cups formed a small fortress around my keyboard, evidence of too many late nights trying to find patterns that weren't there. That particular morning in January 2023, the station was nearly deserted. Just me, the overnight dispatcher finishing up paperwork, and the distant echo of a vacuum cleaner somewhere down the hall. I'd come in early specifically to review the weekend's crime scene footage, hoping fresh eyes might catch something we'd all missed. What I found instead would make me question everything I thought I knew about the people I worked with. Detective Brian Caldwell's footage from the Whitmore Mansion burglary started like any other crime scene video. Brian had been my mentor when I first made detective, a 15-year veteran who knew every shortcut in the city, and always kept a box of fresh donuts in the break room on Fridays. But watching him move through that ransacked study, something felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. He'd arrived after the first responders had already done their initial sweep, walking past the obvious signs of disturbance. Overturned drawers, scattered papers, a broken lamp. Instead of methodically examining the chaos like we'd been trained, Brian went straight to a bookshelf that looked untouched. Without hesitation, he pulled out a specific leather-bound atlas from the third shelf, revealing a wall safe that nobody else had noticed. The way his hand moved directly to that exact book, no searching, no feeling around. It was like watching someone retrieve something from their own home. I rewound the footage and watched again, my coffee growing cold as an uncomfortable weight settled in my stomach. I started pulling up Brian's body cam footage from other recent cases, telling myself I was being paranoid, that maybe he just had incredible instincts developed over his years on the force. The Riverside jewelry store hit from 2 weeks earlier loaded on my screen first. Again, Brian had arrived after the initial response team, and again, he'd found something everyone else missed. A dropped cufflink wedged behind a display case that later proved crucial for identifying the suspect. The footage showed him walking directly to that specific case, crouching down at the exact angle needed to spot the evidence. No systematic searching, no grid pattern like we were taught at the academy. Then I watched his footage from the Hammond residence break-in. This time, he'd discovered a partial fingerprint on the inside of a window frame that the crime scene techs had somehow overlooked. The pattern was becoming undeniable, each video adding another piece to a picture I didn't want to see forming. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard as I considered what to do next. Brian wasn't just my colleague. He'd been the one who showed me how to properly document evidence, who'd covered for me when I'd made a rookie mistake my first week as detective. But I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. I pulled up our case closure rates from the past year, cross-referencing them with Brian's involvement. The numbers made my throat go dry. Every case where Brian had found these miraculous pieces of evidence had been closed within days, usually with suspects who confessed almost immediately or took plea deals. Meanwhile, the cases he wasn't assigned to dragged on for weeks or months. I grabbed my personal notebook, the one I kept locked in my desk drawer, and started documenting everything, writing down timestamps and case numbers in my cramped handwriting. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed and flickered, casting strange shadows across my desk as I worked. The next step required accessing files above my clearance level, but I knew the records clerk, Donna, always came in early on Mondays to catch up on filing. She owed me a favor from when I'd covered for her during her daughter's emergency surgery last fall. I found her in the basement archives, surrounded by towers of manila folders and the musty smell of old paper. When I asked to see the evidence logs for Brian's cases, she raised an eyebrow but pulled them without questions. What I discovered made my pulse race. In every single case where Brian had found crucial evidence, he'd been the last person to access the evidence room the night before the discovery. The login records showed him entering after midnight, staying for 30 to 45 minutes, always when the security desk was staffed by Officer Ramirez, who was notorious for sleeping through his shifts. The pieces were falling into place in the worst possible way. I spent the rest of that morning digging deeper, and what I found turned my unease into genuine fear. Brian's bank records, which I accessed through a contact at Financial Crimes who didn't ask too many questions, showed deposits that didn't match his salary. $5,000 here, $8,000 there, always made within a week of his miraculous evidence discoveries. The deposits came from different LLCs with generic names like Consulting Solutions Group and Professional Services, Inc. A quick search revealed these companies were registered to a private investigation firm run by Anthony Reeves, a former cop who'd left the force under suspicious circumstances 5 years ago. Reeves had a reputation for getting results for his high-paying clients, the kind of people who wanted their stolen property recovered, or needed leverage in messy divorces. My stomach churned as I realized Brian wasn't just finding evidence, he was planting it, selling case information to criminals and PIs who needed to stay ahead of our investigations. Around noon, I heard Brian's distinctive laugh echoing from the break room, and my whole body tensed. He was chatting with other detectives about the upcoming Super Bowl, completely at ease, while I sat at my desk with enough evidence to destroy his career. But I needed more than suspicious patterns and financial records. I needed proof of him actually planting evidence or meeting with Reeves. I decided to tail him that evening, waiting in my beat-up Toyota Camry across from the precinct parking garage. At 6 p.m., Brian walked out like any other day, whistling some old rock song, his badge still clipped to his belt. He drove his silver Ford Explorer through downtown, making several unnecessary turns that told me he was checking for tails. My palms were slick on the steering wheel as I stayed 3 cars back, using every surveillance technique I'd learned. He finally pulled into a parking structure attached to the Marriott on Central Avenue. I parked 2 levels up and took the stairs down, my heart hammering against my ribs with each step. Through the concrete pillars, I watched Brian meet with a man in an expensive suit, Anthony Reeves, looking exactly like his old department photo but with grayer hair and a gold watch that caught the garage's harsh lighting. They stood between 2 SUVs and I could see Brian hand over what looked like a flash drive. I managed to get my phone out and record them, though my fingers trembled so badly I nearly dropped it twice. Their conversation was too quiet to hear clearly, but I caught fragments. Tomorrow's raid, evidence room at 2 a.m., and something about making sure the Morrison kid takes the fall. Reeves handed Brian an envelope that was thick enough to be cash, and they shook hands like old friends closing a business deal. After Reeves drove away, Brian stayed in the garage for another 10 minutes, making a phone call while pacing between the yellow parking lines. I stayed hidden behind a concrete support beam, barely breathing, recording everything until he finally left. That night I couldn't sleep. Every car that passed my apartment made me jump, wondering if Brian had somehow figured out I was onto him. I sat at my kitchen table with all my evidence spread out, printed screenshots, bank records, my handwritten notes, and my phone with the garage video. The smart move would be to go straight to internal affairs, but I knew Brian had friends everywhere, people who'd worked with him for over a decade who'd never believe he was dirty. I needed something undeniable, something that would force them to act immediately. Then I remembered tomorrow's raid that Brian had mentioned. I checked our department schedule on my laptop and found it, a dawn raid on a suspected drug house on Oak Street, with Brian leading the team. If he was planning to plant evidence at 2 a.m., I had to catch him in the act. I set my alarm for 1:30 a.m., placed my service weapon on the nightstand, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, counting down the hours. The evidence room at 2 a.m. was supposed to be empty except for the security guard, but when I arrived at the precinct, I parked a block away and entered through the side entrance using my key card. The hallways were dim, lit only by emergency lighting that made everything look gray and distorted. I could hear my own breathing echoing in the empty corridors as I made my way to the basement where we kept evidence. Sure enough, there was Brian's Explorer in the back lot, and Officer Ramirez was predictably asleep at the security desk, his head tilted back and soft snores filling the silence. I crept past him and down the stairs, using my phone's camera to record everything. The evidence room door was slightly ajar, and through the crack I could see Brian with a duffel bag, carefully placing bags of what looked like cocaine into evidence boxes labeled for tomorrow's raid. He was wearing latex gloves and had disabled the security camera. The red recording light was off. My throat felt like sandpaper as I watched him work methodically, even taking photos of the planted drugs to ensure they'd be discovered in the right locations. I knew I had enough evidence now, but I needed to act fast before Brian finished and destroyed any trace of what he'd done. With shaking fingers, I sent the video directly to Captain Rebecca Walsh's personal email. She was the only person in leadership I trusted completely, having worked with her when she was in internal affairs. Then I did something that probably saved my life. I live-streamed the rest to a private cloud account, making sure everything was backed up in real time. Brian must have heard something because he suddenly stopped and turned toward the door. For a terrifying moment, our eyes met through the crack, and I saw his expression shift from surprise to something cold and calculating. He dropped the evidence bag and reached for his service weapon, but I was already moving, sprinting down the hallway while shouting for Ramirez to wake up. Brian burst out of the evidence room behind me, and I heard him yelling that I was stealing evidence, trying to flip the narrative. But Ramirez had seen Brian's bag full of drugs, had seen him coming out of a room he shouldn't have been in, and most importantly, Captain Walsh was already calling for backup. Within 20 minutes, the precinct was swarming with internal affairs officers and FBI agents. Turns out, Brian had been on their radar for months, but they hadn't been able to prove anything concrete. My videos and documentation were the missing pieces they needed. Brian tried to maintain his innocence at first, claiming I'd set him up, but when they found 3 more burner phones in his car and a detailed ledger of his transactions hidden in his garage, he finally went quiet. The investigation that followed uncovered a network of 4 other officers across different precincts, all working with Reeves to manipulate cases for profit. 17 cases had to be reopened, including 3 where innocent people had been convicted based on planted evidence. Brian got 15 years in federal prison, Reeves got 20, and I got a commendation that felt hollow considering how many lives had been destroyed. I still work at the precinct, but now I review body cam footage with a different kind of attention, knowing that sometimes the real criminals are the ones wearing badges. The Morrison kid, the one Brian was going to frame, he was a 19-year-old college student who'd never had so much as a parking ticket. That's what haunts me most. Not what Brian did, but what almost happened if I hadn't been watching that footage on a quiet Monday morning. The dispatcher's voice crackled through my radio at 9:47 p.m., and right away, something about it made me grip the steering wheel tighter. 6 months patrolling the suburbs outside Portland, and you develop this instinct for which calls are going to stick with you. A woman named Margaret Hobbs, 67 years old, had just whispered into her phone that someone was inside her house at 4782 Willow Court. The dispatcher told me she'd gone silent mid-sentence, just cut off like someone had yanked the words right out of her throat. The line stayed open, though. 40 seconds of dead air, except for what sounded like a television playing some game show. Audience laughter echoing through an empty room. Margaret lived alone since her husband died 2 years back. One of those widows who kept to themselves but always waved when you drove past. October nights in Oregon get cold fast, and I remember cranking the heat as I turned onto her street, thinking about how scared she must be, hiding somewhere in that house. The cul-de-sac looked wrong before I even reached her driveway. Every house had their typical porch lights on, those soft amber glows that make suburbia feel like a cocoon. But Margaret's place blazed like a beacon. Every single window lit up bright white, even the basement and attic windows that nobody ever uses. The house itself was one of those split levels from the 70s, painted this hideous mustard yellow that had faded to something between beige and decay. Her front door hung open about 6 inches, swaying slightly in the wind like it was breathing. I radioed for backup, but dispatch said 20 minutes minimum. A pileup on Highway 26 had everyone tied up. The rules say wait for backup on a potential home invasion, but the rules also say protect and serve, and Margaret Hobbs needed protecting right now. From my cruiser, I could hear that television still going, some host asking about presidents and capitals, and underneath it this rhythmic dripping sound steady as a metronome. I stepped out of the cruiser with my flashlight in one hand, keeping the other near my holster, and announced myself from the driveway. "Police, Margaret Hobbs, this is Officer Price responding to your call." My voice bounced off the empty street and came back to me like an echo in a cave. The neighbors' houses stayed dark and quiet, no curious faces in windows, no one stepping out to see what the commotion was about. That should have been my first real warning. Willow Court was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, where a police car would normally draw at least 3 concerned neighbors in bathrobes. But that night, it felt like the entire street was holding its breath. I approached the front door slowly, noting the door frame showed no signs of damage, no splintered wood or jimmy marks. The door had been opened with a key, or it hadn't been locked at all. Through the gap, I could see into the living room where the TV cast shifting blue light across beige carpet and floral wallpaper that probably hadn't been changed since the house was built. The smell hit me as soon as I pushed the door wider. Pot roast, still cooking, mixed with something else I couldn't place, something chemical and sharp like cleaning supplies, but wrong somehow. "Margaret Hobbs, police, I'm coming inside to check on your welfare." I stepped into the house and nearly jumped out of my skin when the door suddenly slammed shut behind me. Just the wind, I told myself, though I knew damn well the air had been still as death outside. The living room looked lived in but neat. One of those spaces old people keep frozen in time. Doilies on every surface, photos of grandkids in heavy frames, a collection of ceramic angels on the mantel. The TV was playing Jeopardy! Alex Trebek reading questions to an empty room. On the coffee table sat a TV guide open to that day's listings, a pair of reading glasses folded on top, and a cup of tea still steaming, the bag's string draped over the rim like it had just been made. I moved through the living room toward the kitchen, where that dripping sound grew louder. The dining room table stopped me cold. 3 plates set out, but only one had food. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, all half-eaten. The fork still stuck upright in the meat like someone had been interrupted mid-bite. The other 2 plates were clean, untouched, but the silverware was arranged differently at each setting. At the first empty plate, the knife and fork formed an X. At the second, they lay parallel, perfectly aligned. Steam still rose from the food, and when I touched the edge of the plate with the back of my hand, it was warm enough to make me pull away. The phone hung off its cradle on the wall, receiver dangling by its curly cord, swaying slightly, even though there was no breeze in the house. I picked it up and heard the dial tone, then noticed something that made my chest tighten. The phone cord had been cut clean through about 3 feet from the handset, yet somehow it still had a dial tone. The kitchen faucet was the source of that dripping, each drop hitting the steel sink with a metallic pink that seemed too loud in the silence. I turned it off, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps directly above me, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. "Police, come downstairs with your hands visible." The footsteps stopped immediately. I drew my weapon and moved toward the stairs, every nerve in my body screaming that something was fundamentally wrong here. The stairs creaked under my weight, that old house sound that usually feels homey but now felt like an announcement of my position. Halfway up, I noticed the family photos lining the wall. Margaret and her late husband through the decades, their kids, grandkids. But in every single photo, someone had scratched out Margaret's face with something sharp, leaving just jagged holes in the glass where her eyes should have been. Fresh glass shards crunched under my boots, meaning this had been done recently, maybe even while I was downstairs. The upstairs hallway stretched longer than it should have for a house this size, 4 doors on each side, all closed except for one at the far end. That room glowed with the same harsh white light I'd seen from outside, and I could hear what sounded like a woman humming, low and tuneless. I called out again, identifying myself, but the humming continued without pause. I checked each room methodically. A guest bedroom with dust on every surface, a bathroom with the medicine cabinet hanging open, and pill bottles scattered in the sink. A sewing room where every single thread had been pulled from the spools and tangled into a massive knot on the floor. The master bedroom door had been locked from the inside, one of those old push-button locks. But when I pressed my ear against it, I heard nothing. The humming from the lit room at the end never stopped, never varied in pitch or rhythm, like a recording stuck on loop. I reached the last room and pushed the door fully open with my foot, weapon raised. It was Margaret's husband's old study. She'd apparently kept it exactly as he'd left it. Medical journals stacked on the desk, a stethoscope draped over the chair. He'd been a doctor, from the looks of it. The humming came from an old cassette player on the bookshelf, the kind from the 80s with the silver buttons. But what made me radio for immediate backup was the wall behind the desk. Someone had written the same sentence over and over in what looked like black marker, covering every inch from floor to ceiling, the handwriting getting smaller and more frantic toward the edges. "She's still on the phone." Hundreds of times, maybe thousands, and the marker was still there on the desk, cap off, tip still wet. I ejected the cassette and the humming stopped, revealing another sound I hadn't noticed before. Breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere in the room. I spun around, checking every corner, but I was alone. The breathing continued, and I realized with a sick feeling that it was coming from the heating vent in the floor. I got down on my knees and shined my flashlight through the grate, the metal cold against my face. 2 eyes reflected back at me from about 3 feet down in the ductwork, wide and unblinking, and then they were gone, followed by the sound of someone crawling fast through the metal tubes, the banging and scraping echoing through the entire house. I jumped back and called it in. Possible suspect in the ventilation system, requesting immediate backup and possibly fire department to access the crawl space. The dispatcher confirmed units were 5 minutes out. Those eyes hadn't looked crazed or wild. They'd looked terrified, like whoever was down there was hiding from something else. I ran back downstairs to check the basement access, and that's when I saw the kitchen had changed. The plates on the dining table were now stacked in the sink, washed and drying in the rack. The pot roast was gone, the stove turned off, everything cleaned and put away like dinner had never happened. The phone was back on its cradle, and when I picked it up, the cord was intact, no sign it had ever been cut. My radio crackled with the dispatcher's voice asking for a status update, but before I could respond, I heard the front door open upstairs. I'd come down the back stairs that led directly to the kitchen. Footsteps crossed the living room, slow and measured, and then I heard a woman's voice, clear as day. "Yes, I'd like to report an intruder in my home. He's in my kitchen right now." My blood turned to ice because I recognized that voice from the original 911 call. It was Margaret Hobbs. I moved toward the living room, weapon drawn, announcing myself again. But when I rounded the corner, the room was empty. The TV was off, the lights were off, and through the window I could see my backup pulling into the driveway, their red and blue lights painting the walls. But on the coffee table, that same cup of tea sat steaming, and next to it was a note written in the same handwriting from upstairs. She never left the phone. We searched that house for 3 hours. 2 more units, a K-9 team, and even the fire department with their thermal imaging cameras. They found nobody in the vents. No trace anyone had been there except for some dust disturbance that could have been decades old. The basement had been locked from the outside with a padlock rusted shut for what looked like years. Margaret Hobbs wasn't there, wasn't at any neighbor's house, wasn't at the hospital or her daughter's place in Seattle. Her car was in the garage, keys on the hook by the door, purse on the counter with her wallet inside. The daughter drove down that night, confirmed her mother's reading glasses, confirmed that was her teacup, even confirmed the pot roast was her mother's usual Monday dinner. But she also told us something that made everyone exchange looks. Her mother had been having memory issues lately, confusion, sometimes thinking her dead husband was still alive, sometimes preparing dinner for him. We sealed the house as a potential crime scene, and I went home at 3 a.m. thinking maybe Margaret had wandered off. Maybe she'd had an episode and was confused somewhere in the neighborhood. 4 hours later, at 7:23 a.m., I was in my kitchen making coffee when my cell rang. It was dispatch, and the exhaustion in her voice was replaced with something else. Disbelief, maybe fear. Another 911 call had just come in from Margaret Hobbs's house. Same woman's voice, same whispered report of an intruder. The house had been sealed with crime scene tape. An officer posted outside all night who swore nobody had gone in or out. But the call was definitely coming from inside the house. They could trace it to the landline. I drove back there, met up with the same sergeant from the night before, and we entered together. Everything was exactly as we'd left it, tape undisturbed, evidence markers still in place. Except the phone was off the hook again, receiver hanging just like before. And when we checked the 911 recording, you could hear Margaret's voice clear as day, but also something else in the background, my own voice from hours earlier, echoing like it was playing back, saying, "Margaret Hobbs, police, I'm coming inside to check on your welfare." The call lasted exactly 40 seconds, just like the first one, then cut to dead air. We never found Margaret Hobbs. Her daughter had her declared legally missing after 6 months, then legally dead after 2 years. The house stood empty for a while before the daughter finally sold it to a young couple from California who got it for way under market value. I kept tabs on the place, drove by sometimes on my patrol route. The new owners lasted 8 months before moving out, said they kept getting phone calls in the middle of the night, with nobody on the other end, just the sound of a TV playing in the background. The next family made it 4 months. The house has been for sale for 3 years now, and the realtor told me off the record that potential buyers always ask about the phone that keeps ringing during showings, even though the service was disconnected years ago. The police department officially closed the case as a missing person, probable dementia-related disappearance, but those of us who were there that night know something else happened in that house. I'm at a different precinct now, moved to day shifts downtown where the calls are about real things, robberies, accidents, domestic disputes. But sometimes, when I'm writing up a report late at night and the station is quiet, our emergency line will ring and nobody will answer the dispatcher. They'll stay on the line for exactly 40 seconds before hanging up. The number always traces back to disconnected lines, old houses, places that shouldn't be able to make calls anymore. Last week, one traced back to Margaret Hobbs' old number. The dispatcher, a new kid who wasn't there that night, said he could hear someone whispering but couldn't make out the words, just that it sounded like an old woman asking for help. I told him it was probably a glitch in the system. Old numbers sometimes ghost through the network, but I know Margaret is still trying to finish that first call, still trying to tell us something about who was in her house that night. Or maybe she's trying to warn us that whoever was there never actually left. I was 23 and fresh out of the academy when I got assigned to work under Detective Emily Harris in 2012. People called her the bulldog behind her back, not because she was mean, but because once she got her teeth into a case, she never let go. I'd been shadowing her for about 3 months, mostly petty theft and domestic disputes, nothing that really tested either of us. That changed on a humid Saturday morning in early July, when we got called to an apartment complex on the north side of town. The building was one of those converted warehouses from the 1940s, all exposed brick and industrial windows, the kind of place young professionals loved because it had character. We'd been told it was a possible suicide, but Emily had this way of narrowing her eyes when dispatch gave us information, like she could smell when something wasn't quite right through the radio waves. The apartment belonged to a guy named Kevin Brewster, 28 years old. Worked as a graphic designer for some startup downtown. The super had found him after Kevin's boss called asking why he hadn't shown up for 3 days straight. When we got there, the hallway was already crowded with uniforms and the medical examiner's team. The smell hit me first, that sweet, cloying stench that sticks to the inside of your nostrils for days. Emily didn't even flinch, just pulled on her gloves and ducked under the yellow tape. Kevin's door had one of those expensive electronic locks, the kind you program with codes instead of keys. The super swore up and down that it had been locked from the inside when he arrived, had to use his master override to get in. Inside, Kevin was sprawled on his living room floor, still wearing his work clothes from what looked like several days ago. Khakis and a button-down shirt with some tech company's logo on the pocket. The medical examiner, Dr. Patel, was already crouched beside the body when we walked in. He had this habit of humming classical music while he worked, something that always made crime scenes feel even more surreal. There were no obvious wounds that I could see, no blood pooling, no bruising around the neck, nothing that screamed violence. Kevin just looked like he'd decided to take a nap on his hardwood floor and never woke up. But Emily was already moving through the apartment like a bloodhound, examining every surface, every corner. She stopped at the kitchen counter where a half-eaten Chinese takeout container sat next to an empty beer bottle. The food had long since started growing mold, these fuzzy white and green patches that made my stomach turn. She took photos of everything, the angle of Kevin's body, the position of his hands, even the way his shirt was untucked on just one side. That's when Mrs. Kowalczyk from next door showed up in the hallway, practically vibrating with the need to tell someone what she knew. She was probably 70, wearing a housecoat covered in cartoon cats and slippers that had seen better decades. She grabbed Emily's arm the second we stepped out to talk to her, her fingers surprisingly strong for someone her age. "I heard them fighting," she said, her Polish accent thick with excitement and fear. 3 nights ago, maybe around 11, Kevin and someone else yelling so loud I could hear it through these old walls. She insisted it was definitely 2 distinct voices, male voices, and that she'd heard Kevin's door slam around midnight. Then she heard footsteps going down the hall toward the stairs, heavy ones, like someone wearing boots. But here's what made Emily's expression change. Mrs. Kowalczyk swore she never heard Kevin's door open or close again after that night. And she would know because her apartment was right next to his, and she barely slept anymore since her husband died. Emily spent the next hour interviewing everyone on that floor, while I went through Kevin's apartment more carefully. His laptop was still open on his desk, stuck on the login screen, battery long dead. There were design projects scattered across his workspace. Logos, website mock-ups, business cards for various clients. One caught my eye because it was printed on expensive paper, some law firm called Brennan and Associates. I bagged it along with everything else that seemed relevant. The bathroom medicine cabinet was full of the usual stuff: ibuprofen, allergy medication, some prescription antidepressants dated from 6 months earlier. But what really stood out was what wasn't there. No signs of a struggle anywhere. No defensive wounds on Kevin's hands when I looked closer. The windows were all locked from the inside, and this was a 4th-floor apartment with no fire escape. The only way in or out was through that front door with the electronic lock. The building's security setup was a joke. Just one camera in the lobby that the super admitted had been broken for 2 weeks before Kevin died. But Emily wasn't giving up that easy. She got the records from the electronic lock company, and this is where things got really strange. The lock's memory showed Kevin's code being entered at 7:43 p.m. 3 nights ago, then nothing until the super's override code at 10:15 a.m. when they found him. No other codes, no forced entry attempts, nothing. The lock company tech, this nervous kid named Bradley who kept pushing his glasses up his nose, explained that these locks were supposedly tamper-proof. If someone tried to hack it or use a keycard reader, it would log the attempt. But the log was clean. Emily had him check 3 times, even had his supervisor come down and verify. According to that lock, nobody went in or out of Kevin's apartment after 7:43 p.m., which lined up with when Kevin probably got home from work. The autopsy results came back 2 days later, and Dr. Patel looked genuinely puzzled when he called Emily. Cause of death was cardiac arrest, but Kevin was a healthy 28-year-old with no history of heart problems. The toxicology report showed something else though, traces of a synthetic compound that Patel couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't any standard drug or poison in their database. He sent samples to a specialized lab in Chicago, told us it would take at least a week to get results. Meanwhile, Emily had me digging into Kevin's life like we were archaeologists. His bank records showed regular deposits from his freelance work, nothing unusual there. But there was a cash withdrawal of $8,000 made 2 weeks before his death. When we asked his friends about it, nobody knew what it was for. His best friend Jamie said Kevin had been acting paranoid lately, always looking around when they went out, sometimes canceling plans at the last minute. We tracked down Kevin's ex-girlfriend, Natalie, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. She hadn't seen him in months but mentioned something that made Emily sit up straighter. About 6 months ago, right before they broke up, Kevin had gotten involved with some guys who claimed they could help him expand his design business, get him contracts with bigger companies. She never met them, but Kevin would sometimes leave for meetings late at night, always came back tense and quiet. One time she saw a text on his phone from someone saved as just M that said, "You better deliver or we'll handle this differently." When she confronted Kevin about it, they had a huge fight and broke up shortly after. She tried calling him a few times after that, worried about him, but he never returned her calls. The last time she tried was about a month before he died, and his voicemail box was full. The lab in Chicago finally identified the compound. It was a derivative of succinylcholine, a paralytic drug used in hospitals during surgery. But this version had been modified somehow, made to break down faster in the body, harder to detect. Dr. Patel explained that if someone had been injected with it, they would have been completely paralyzed but fully conscious for maybe 10 to 15 minutes before their respiratory system shut down. The thought of Kevin lying there, unable to move or call for help, aware of everything happening to him, made me physically sick. But here's the problem. There were no injection marks on his body. Patel checked everywhere, even between his toes and under his hairline. The only way the drug could have entered his system was orally, probably mixed with something he ate or drank. Emily immediately thought of the Chinese food and beer, but the restaurant checked out clean, and the beer bottle was a brand Kevin bought regularly from the corner store. Then we caught a break, or at least we thought we did. A guy named Vincent Russo got picked up for assault in a bar fight, and when they ran his prints, he had a connection to Kevin. They'd gone to community college together years ago. Under questioning, Vincent admitted he'd been hired to send a message to Kevin about some money he owed. He said he went to Kevin's apartment that night with another guy, Tommy Garza, just to scare him. According to Vincent, they argued with Kevin about payment for some services Kevin had agreed to provide, creating fake IDs and documents using his design skills. Kevin had taken the $8,000 as a down payment, but then got cold feet, tried to back out. Vincent swore they just yelled at him, maybe pushed him around a little, but left him very much alive. He said Tommy might have slipped something in Kevin's beer when he wasn't looking, just to mess with him, but nothing that should have killed him. But here's where everything fell apart. Tommy Garza had an alibi. He was in lockup in Indiana that night for a DUI. Didn't get released until 2 days after Kevin died. Vincent's story changed 3 times in the next hour, each version different from the last. First he said they left at midnight, then 11:30. Then he wasn't sure if he'd even gone to Kevin's apartment at all. His lawyer showed up and shut down the interrogation, and without physical evidence placing Vincent at the scene, we had to let him go. No fingerprints except Kevin's in the apartment. The DNA from the beer bottle and takeout containers all came back as Kevin's. Even the hallway cameras from the building next door, which had a partial view of Kevin's building entrance, showed nobody entering or leaving during the time frame Mrs. Kowalczyk described. Emily went through that footage frame by frame, hours of it, until her eyes were bloodshot. She kept muttering about how someone had to have been there. The neighbor heard them, but the evidence just wasn't there. The case went cold after 6 months. Emily never stopped working it, even after I got transferred to another precinct. She'd call me sometimes with new theories. Maybe someone had climbed between balconies. Maybe there was a second electronic code that got erased somehow. Maybe the lock company was involved, but nothing ever panned out. Vincent Russo died in a motorcycle accident 2 years later, took whatever he really knew with him. Tommy Garza disappeared completely. Some said he fled to Mexico. The building eventually changed the locks to regular deadbolts after 2 more residents complained about glitches with the electronic system. Mrs. Kowalczyk passed away in 2016, still insisting she knew what she heard that night. Emily retired in 2018, and at her retirement party, after a few drinks, she told me that the Kevin Brewster case was the one that would haunt her forever. Not because of what we found, but because of what we couldn't explain. How does someone get into a locked apartment, poison a man, and vanish without leaving a single trace? To this day, whenever I pass by that converted warehouse building, I still wonder what really happened in apartment 4B that July night in 2012. "12 years on the force, and I thought I'd seen everything our small Pennsylvania town could throw at me. Cold cases became my specialty about 2 years ago, which meant spending most of my days in the basement evidence room, surrounded by boxes of forgotten crimes. My wife Susan used to joke that I was becoming part of the furniture down there, and honestly, she wasn't far off. I'd gotten comfortable with the routine. Pull a file, review witness statements, make some calls, update the digital records, repeat. Most detectives avoided the evidence room like the plague because of how depressing it felt. All those unsolved cases just sitting there collecting dust. But I actually found it peaceful. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly, the air smelled like old paper and mildew, and the only sounds were usually my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. That all changed on a Monday morning in November 2017, when I discovered someone had been tampering with my cases. I'd gone down to retrieve the Garrett homicide files from 1989, a case I'd been reviewing for the past month. The box should have been exactly where I left it on shelf B14, 3rd row from the bottom, case number clearly marked on the side in black marker. Instead, I found it sitting on the floor beside the shelf with its lid crooked and the contents obviously disturbed. My first thought was that maybe Stan, our evidence clerk who'd worked there since the 90s, had needed to move things around for some reason. But Stan was meticulous about logging any changes, and he would have emailed me if he'd touched my active cases. The security system showed the real problem. According to the keycard logs, nobody had entered the evidence room since I'd left on Friday afternoon. Only 6 people had access: myself, 2 other cold case detectives named Ford and Castellano, Stan, Captain Rogers, and Deputy Chief Hawthorne. Yet here was undeniable proof that someone had been here, going through these specific files. The Garrett case wasn't random either. It involved the murder of a 19-year-old college student found beaten to death behind a warehouse on the outskirts of town. The original investigation had stalled after 3 months with no solid leads, no witnesses, and forensic technology that couldn't do much with the limited evidence collected. What made me suspicious was how specific the tampering was. The crime scene photos were shuffled out of order, witness statements had been rearranged, but most concerning was that the original investigating officer's handwritten notes were completely missing. Those notes, written by Detective Roy Brennan, who'd retired 8 years ago, contained details that never made it into the official typed reports. I'd read them just 2 weeks earlier, and they'd mentioned several persons of interest who were never formally interviewed, including the son of a prominent local businessman who'd had connections to several city officials at the time. I decided to check the other cold cases I'd been working on, and that's when my chest started to tighten with genuine fear. 3 more boxes showed signs of tampering. The Melissa Howard disappearance from 1992, the John Doe found in the river in 1987, and the Blackwood family double homicide from 1995. Each box had been carefully searched, with specific documents either missing or rearranged. The pattern became clear quickly. Someone was specifically targeting cases from the late 80s and early 90s, all unsolved murders or disappearances, and they were removing or disturbing documents that referenced certain investigating officers or witness statements. My mind raced as I stood there in that cold basement, surrounded by decades of tragedy and secrets. Whoever was doing this had intimate knowledge of these cases and knew exactly what they were looking for. They also had to have a way into this room that bypassed our security system, which should have been impossible. I spent the rest of that Monday documenting everything with my phone camera, taking pictures of every disturbed box, every out-of-place file. I didn't report it immediately because something told me to be careful, to gather more information first. That instinct probably saved my career, maybe even my life. Instead of going through official channels, I went to the local electronics store during my lunch break and bought 3 small wireless cameras, the kind people use for home security. They were tiny, about the size of a button, with motion sensors and night vision capabilities. I returned to the evidence room that evening after most people had left, claiming I needed to work late on a case. Installing the cameras took less than 20 minutes. One pointed at the main entrance, another covering the shelves where the tampered boxes were stored, and the third overlooking the far corner where old surveillance equipment and evidence computers were kept. The cameras would send alerts and video directly to my personal phone, completely bypassing the department's systems. For 3 days, nothing happened. I checked the feeds obsessively, watching hours of empty footage showing nothing but shadows and stillness. I started to wonder if maybe I was being paranoid, if there was some logical explanation I'd missed. Then, on Friday morning at 3:47 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I grabbed it from my nightstand, careful not to wake Susan, and opened the camera app with trembling fingers. The infrared image was grainy, but clear enough to see a figure moving through the evidence room. They were wearing dark clothing and had something covering their face, maybe a ski mask or balaclava. But what made my mouth go dry was how they moved, with complete confidence, going straight to specific shelves without hesitation, like they'd done this dozens of times before. They pulled out the Blackwood family homicide box and began methodically going through it, using a small flashlight to read documents before photographing certain pages with what looked like a phone. I sat up in bed, recording everything on my phone while watching this person work. They spent exactly 12 minutes in the room, and during that time, they removed several documents from the Blackwood box and placed them in a black folder they'd brought with them. Then something happened that made me nearly drop my phone. The figure walked over to the old evidence computer in the corner and logged in without hesitation. They knew the password. They navigated through the system for about 5 minutes, and I could see the screen's glow reflecting off their mask as they worked. Whatever they were doing, they'd clearly done it before. The way their fingers moved across the keyboard showed familiarity with our internal systems that only someone from inside the department would have. When they finished, they carefully returned the box to its shelf, adjusted it to look undisturbed, and walked toward the exit. Just before leaving, they did something that sent ice through my veins. They looked directly at one of my cameras, stared at it for maybe 2 seconds, then continued out the door as if they hadn't seen anything. The next morning, I arrived at the station earlier than usual, around 6 a.m. I needed to check that evidence computer before anyone else got there. The login history had been wiped clean, but I knew enough about our system to check the deeper logs that most people didn't know existed. What I found made me sick to my stomach. Someone had been accessing the database regularly for the past 18 months, always between 2 and 4 a.m., always when the building was supposed to be empty. They'd been systematically viewing and altering records for dozens of cold cases, all from that same era. But here's what really got me. The alterations were subtle, just small changes to witness statements, minor adjustments to timelines, names spelled slightly differently. Nothing that would trigger an alert, but enough to make these cases practically impossible to solve if anyone ever tried to revisit them. I cross-referenced the altered cases with department records from the original investigations, and that's when I noticed the pattern that changed everything. Every single altered case had originally been investigated by a group of 4 detectives who all worked together in the late 80s and early 90s. Roy Brennan, who'd retired, Paul Garrison, died of a heart attack in 2010, Deputy Chief Hawthorne, still active, and Captain Rogers, also still active. These 4 had been partners and friends, often working cases together or covering for each other. The more I dug, the more disturbing details emerged. Several witnesses from those old cases had complained about intimidation, evidence that disappeared, and leads that were never followed. But all those complaints had been buried in administrative files, deemed unsubstantiated by internal reviews conducted by, guess who, Hawthorne and Rogers themselves. I found a particularly damning report from 1993, where a witness named Jennifer Moss had claimed that Detective Garrison threatened her family if she testified about seeing a certain person at the Blackwood crime scene. That person was the nephew of a major construction company owner who'd won several city contracts around that time. The witness retracted her statement 2 days later, and the case went cold. I knew I needed more evidence before I could take this to anyone, especially since 2 of the suspected officers were my direct superiors. I spent the weekend at home, pretending everything was normal while secretly copying all my findings onto multiple flash drives. Susan noticed I was distracted, kept asking if everything was okay at work, and I had to lie to her for the first time in our marriage. That hurt almost as much as discovering the corruption. On Monday, I went back to reviewing my camera footage from Friday night, this time focusing on details I might have missed. That's when I noticed something crucial. The intruder had a slight limp in their left leg, a distinctive way of favoring their right side when walking. I'd seen that exact gait before. Deputy Chief Hawthorne had the same limp from an old injury he'd gotten during a pursuit in 2003, a story he loved to tell at department gatherings. The build was right too. Tall, broad shoulders, the way he carried himself even when trying to disguise it. I couldn't go to Captain Rogers. He was likely involved. I couldn't go to Hawthorne for obvious reasons. The only option was to go outside the department, but I needed absolutely bulletproof evidence first. I set up more cameras, this time hidden throughout the evidence room in places nobody would think to look, inside old evidence boxes that hadn't been touched in decades, behind loose ceiling tiles, even inside a broken printer that had been sitting in the corner for years. Then I did something risky. I started leaving subtle traps. I'd place tiny pieces of transparent tape on certain boxes in specific patterns that would break if someone opened them. I photographed every single placement. I also started making loud comments around the station about how close I was to breaking the Garrett case, how I'd found new leads that could blow everything wide open. It was all lies, but I needed to force their hand, make them sloppy. Hawthorne's reaction was telling. He suddenly became very interested in my work, stopping by my desk multiple times a day to check on my progress, with a smile that never reached his eyes. The confrontation came 2 days later, but not how I expected. I was working late, legitimately this time, when Hawthorne walked into my office around 9 p.m. He closed the door behind him and sat down across from me, perfectly calm. "You've been busy lately," he said, his voice steady and almost friendly. "Those cameras you installed are impressive, very thorough." My heart hammered, but I kept my face neutral, asking what he meant. He leaned back and laughed, actually laughed, before telling me I had two choices. Option 1, I could take early retirement with full benefits, a glowing recommendation and a nice bonus for my years of dedicated service. Option 2, things could get complicated. He didn't elaborate on what complicated meant, but he mentioned how unfortunate it would be if certain evidence appeared linking me to mishandled cases, how my reputation could be destroyed, how these things could affect my family. He gave me 48 hours to decide, then walked out like we'd just discussed the weather. That night I made copies of everything and drove 3 hours to the FBI field office in Philadelphia, where I handed over 18 months of evidence to agents who'd been investigating similar patterns in 3 other counties. The arrests happened 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. FBI agents swept through our department and 3 others simultaneously, arresting Hawthorne, Rogers, and 14 other current and former officers across the region. The investigation revealed a 30-year conspiracy involving bribes from local crime families, evidence tampering, and at least 11 murders that had been deliberately covered up. Some victims were people who'd threatened to expose the corruption. Others were just inconvenient witnesses to crimes committed by people with the right connections. Roy Brennan, the retired detective, cut a deal and testified against everyone in exchange for reduced charges. He revealed how they'd been taking money since 1987, how they'd pick which cases to bury, how they'd threaten or pay off witnesses. The Garrett case that started my investigation? Turns out the kid had been killed by the son of that businessman I'd read about, and the whole thing had been covered up for a $50,000 payment split 4 ways. I testified for 3 days straight, showing my videos, my evidence, everything I'd gathered. Hawthorne got 35 years, Rogers got 28, and the others got various sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. The FBI offered me a job, but I turned it down. I stayed in town, took over as head of a newly formed cold case unit with federal oversight, and we've solved 17 cases in the past 3 years using evidence that had been deliberately hidden. Susan says I sleep better now, and she's right. Sometimes I still go down to that evidence room, now completely reorganized and under new management, and I think about all those families who finally got answers. The room doesn't feel haunted anymore. It feels like a place where truth finally won. My name's Sarah Bennett, and at that point in my career I'd been working late shifts more often than I'd like to admit. Most nights were quiet, filled with paperwork and the occasional noise complaint, but that particular night, my phone buzzed with a call that immediately pulled me out of routine. A family reported seeing a masked man standing in their hallway. The father's voice on the line carried this strange mix of urgency and confusion, like he couldn't decide if what he'd witnessed had really happened. I drove over thinking it would be another case of shadows or nerves. What I walked into was nothing I could file away under overreaction. The house was a 2-story colonial, clean and orderly in a way that told me the family wasn't the type to dramatize. Inside, the air felt heavy with that kind of silence people force on themselves when they're terrified of being heard. The mother, Claire, was clutching her son's arm so tightly he had faint red marks where her fingers dug in. The boy couldn't have been older than 10, but his wide eyes looked years ahead of him in fear. The father, Mark, kept pacing from the front door to the staircase, repeating the same line. I saw him. He was right there. His certainty wasn't shaken, not even by the locked windows and doors I'd already checked myself. I walked them through the house, asking them to show me where exactly the figure had stood. The hallway light was still on, casting a pale yellow glow on the polished wooden floor. Mark pointed to the end of the hall, right outside the bedrooms. He said the man didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in a black mask until Mark shouted. And then somehow, he was gone. What unsettled me wasn't the story itself, but the detail that all the locks were intact. No sign of forced entry, no open windows, no damage anywhere. It didn't add up, and the family's collective unease made it hard to dismiss as imagination. The turning point of the walkthrough came in the master bedroom. I noticed something the family hadn't mentioned: a dining chair wedged neatly under the inside doorknob. It was positioned in such a deliberate way that it could only mean someone tried to barricade the door from inside. Claire gasped when she saw it and swore they hadn't put it there. Mark backed her up instantly, his voice almost cracking. Their son started crying again, saying he wanted to leave the house. I leaned closer to inspect the chair and immediately knew I had to call in for fingerprint analysis. That's when the night began to feel less like a domestic call and more like I had stepped into someone else's game. The crime scene unit arrived quickly, and while they dusted for prints, I sat with the family in their living room. The house suddenly felt smaller, as if every shadow had its own secret. Claire tried to busy herself by straightening magazines on the coffee table, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Mark kept pulling back the curtains and checking outside, though he knew the locks hadn't been tampered with. Their son sat wrapped in a blanket, refusing to speak anymore. I've been around panic before, but this wasn't just fear. It was the confusion of people who no longer trusted the safety of their own walls. When the fingerprint tech approached me, he didn't say much, just raised his eyebrows in a way that signaled trouble. The prints on the chair didn't match any member of the family. Not partial, not smudged, but clean, deliberate impressions, as if whoever did it wanted us to know they were there. The realization weighed on me. If someone had really been inside, how did they get out without triggering a single lock or leaving a trace? I didn't share that detail with the family right away. They were shaken enough. Instead, I excused myself and walked the perimeter again, searching for something I might have overlooked. Outside, the night air was crisp, and the backyard stretched into a line of tall trees swaying under the dim streetlight glow. I scanned the ground carefully, expecting footprints in the soil, but there was nothing, not even a scuff. The grass looked untouched. The only thing that stood out was a faint impression on the side of the porch railing, as though someone had leaned there briefly. It wasn't enough to prove entry or exit, but paired with that barricaded bedroom door, it made the whole scene feel intentional, staged almost. Whoever this masked figure was, he wanted them unsettled. Back inside, I decided to ask the boy again, gently this time, away from his parents. Kids see details adults miss even when fear clouds their memory. He whispered that the man hadn't just stood there. He tilted his head slightly, like he was listening. The detail chilled me more than anything else that night. I walked him back to his parents, replaying his words in my head. A stranger silently listening inside their home, with no forced entry, no broken locks, and foreign fingerprints on a chair. The deeper I dug, the less it resembled a standard break-in. Hours slipped by while we combed through every inch of the house. Nothing new surfaced and fatigue set in. Claire begged me to stay a little longer, so I kept my notebook open, circling the same details, hoping fresh eyes would catch something. Then, almost as if on cue, the fingerprint results came back. No matches in any database. Whoever had been in that bedroom wasn't some random burglar already on record. That realization turned the whole night from a security breach into something stranger. Someone methodical, precise, and entirely untraceable had walked through their hallway. Before leaving, I asked Mark to demonstrate again what he saw. We stood in the same hallway, the yellow bulb flickering above us. He described the stillness of the masked figure, the silence, the way he thought it was a prank until the man vanished. His words didn't waver, and I could almost picture it myself. As he spoke, I noticed the chair had been removed from the bedroom and set back against the wall, exactly where it belonged at the dining table. None of us had moved it. I didn't announce it aloud, but the hair on my arms rose all the same. I finally convinced them to spend the night at a relative's house while we secured the property. As they packed quickly, I stayed near the doorway, scanning every surface one more time. The house gave nothing away, but it didn't feel empty either. It felt watched. Before leaving, I locked the door myself, tested it twice, and drove behind the family's car until they reached the highway. My cruiser's headlights stretched over their rear bumper, and I kept replaying the boy's words, how the man had tilted his head, like he was listening. Listening for what? Listening to whom? The report I filed that morning was clinical, stripped of the unease that clung to me. I wrote down the facts. Unidentified prints, no forced entry, objects moved without explanation. But the truth I carried was heavier. Someone had been inside that home with an ease I couldn't explain, and they left behind just enough evidence to make sure we knew it. To this day, the family never returned to live there full time, and I can't blame them. Whenever I think of that night, it isn't the mask that unsettles me most. It's the silence of that barricaded bedroom, a silence that didn't belong to the house at all. When I think back on my time wearing the badge, there's one night that has stuck with me in a way no other call ever has. My name's Dana Collins, and during that period I was assigned to routine patrols in a small, quiet stretch of highway that rarely made headlines. I wasn't chasing high-profile cases or working big city beats. Most of my nights involved checking on noise complaints, the occasional DUI, or writing up reports for property disputes. That's why I remember the call about the old roadside motel so clearly. At first glance, it seemed like another dull nuisance, just a group of kids breaking in where they shouldn't. The place had been closed down for years, the sign faded, half the letters broken, with weeds climbing high enough to choke the parking lot. The building itself sat low against the road, paint peeling in wide strips that looked like skin sunburned and left to flake. Folks in town used to whisper that the place had been cursed. After a string of sudden closures, a fire, and a few unexplained accidents, no owner ever held onto it for long. By the time I started responding to calls there, it was more of an eyesore than a landmark, the kind of property people avoided without really knowing why. That night I was dispatched after another report of trespassers. The caller claimed they had seen lights moving inside the boarded windows, though there was no power running to the building. It was already past midnight when I pulled into the gravel lot. My headlights swept across the cracked asphalt, catching a cluster of broken beer bottles and spray paint cans near the steps. I figured it would be the usual group of teens daring each other to stay inside until I showed up. Still, the air around the motel carried a strange heaviness, like the silence wasn't natural but deliberate. Walking inside required a firm push. The front door had swollen from water damage and groaned when it gave way. The lobby was stripped bare, only a desk and a few toppled chairs left. My flashlight beam cut through the dust, revealing graffiti on nearly every wall. I announced myself the way we're trained to. Loud, firm, letting any trespassers know law enforcement was present. No answer. I checked room after room, each one in worse shape than the last. Mattresses slashed open, doors hanging loose, floorboards warped with mold. Then, in the far hallway, I noticed something odd. The proportions of one room didn't match the rest. The space inside seemed smaller than what the building's layout should have allowed. I walked back into the hallway and studied the walls more carefully. On one side, the wallpaper was peeling at a sharp vertical seam that didn't line up with the studs. I pressed against it with my hand, and it gave slightly, almost like a hollow panel. My pulse quickened, not from fear exactly, but from the sense that I had stumbled into something beyond routine trespassing. After a few shoves, the false wall creaked open, revealing a narrow gap. The air that escaped from it smelled different, a sour, stale odor that had been trapped inside far too long. The passage led to a hidden corridor, narrower than the motel's actual hallways, lined with plywood doors. Each one had a peephole cut into it from the inside, not the outside. When I crouched to shine my light through one of them, the beam landed on a small room no bigger than a closet, furnished with nothing but a rusted cot and chains bolted to the wall. A camera mount still screwed into the corner faced directly at the bed, The silence in that space pressed down on me harder than any noise could have. Whoever had built this hadn't done it for pranks or storage. It was deliberate, calculated. I forced myself to check the other doors. Every hidden room was the same. A place to confine someone, record them, and leave no trace. In some of them, the cameras were still hanging, their wires running through holes that led to the walls of the adjacent motel rooms. From those guest rooms, someone could sit comfortably, watch everything live, and no one outside would ever suspect. I had handled crime scenes before, but nothing in my training prepared me for the sheer scale of what I was looking at. Each detail screamed of planning, patience, and cruelty. By the time I reached the end of the hidden corridor, I found what looked like an office cobbled together from plywood and scavenged furniture. Stacks of ledgers sat on the desk, some of them water-damaged but still legible. Inside were names, dates, and even descriptions. Some entries were marked with red X's, others with notes that didn't make sense until I thought about them in the context of missing persons cases I'd read over the years. It was like standing inside a ledger of the disappeared. At that moment, the trespassing calls made more sense. Someone had been returning to this place, maybe to recover what was left behind. I radioed for backup, my voice steadier than I expected, though inside I felt like the floor had shifted under me. Dispatch confirmed units were en route, but it would take time to reach such an isolated stretch of road. While waiting, I kept moving through the office. There were VHS tapes stacked in milk crates, each labeled with nothing more than a number and a date. The thought of what might be on them turned my mouth dry, but I couldn't bring myself to play one. The silence of the motel felt amplified, as if the walls were holding their breath with me. When backup arrived, I wasn't the only one unsettled. The other officers wore the same expression I did, like they had stumbled into a story that no one would believe without proof. Crime scene investigators worked the place for weeks, cataloging everything: the hidden architecture, the recording equipment, the ledgers, the tapes. Cross-referenced with missing persons reports from nearby states, the evidence painted a horrifying picture. Dozens of names matched. People who had vanished on road trips, business travel, even locals who had simply walked out one day and never came back. They had all been funneled through this forgotten roadside motel. The case drew state and federal attention fast. Forensic teams uncovered fingerprints, DNA traces, and signs that the motel had been in operation far longer than anyone imagined. Whoever ran it had vanished without a trace, leaving only the architecture of cruelty behind. I was interviewed countless times, asked to retrace every step of the night I found the hidden corridor. The weight of it sat with me differently than any other case. It wasn't just evidence on paper. It was the memory of that first hidden door giving way under my hand, revealing a world no one should have been able to conceal. Eventually, the motel was condemned and sealed off. Some wanted to tear it down, but preservation orders kept it standing as evidence in ongoing investigations. Even now, years later, I can't drive past that stretch of highway without feeling the pull of it. The trespassing calls stopped, almost like the discovery had silenced whatever lingered there. I don't know if the people responsible were ever caught, or if they simply moved on to another location. What I do know is this: behind those false walls were the lives of countless missing people, and I'll never forget the moment I realized I was standing in the middle of their graveyard.